Okay, guys, let's transition into our regular meeting. And so the commission will be in order, and we will transition into the reports from the commission. So let's begin with reports from the university. Mr. Palmer.
Hi. Yeah, I guess since last month I don't really have much to report. So just pass it on to the next person. Thanks.
Okay. Ms. Russell.
I have two upcoming meetings to report. The Rivanna Urban Corridor Steering Committee committee will be meeting later this month. That more information about the Rivanna River Urban Corridor is available on the TJPDC site, tjpdc.org, under the section titled Area Plans. And there are some historic recordings of previous workshops available. And the plan is that the steering committee will meet and then a public meeting will be scheduled at a later date. Secondly, there is an upcoming Fontaine Avenue Steering Committee. And that is it's a public design hearing hosted by the Charlottesville Department of Public Works. It will be for the Fontaine Avenue Streetscape project. It will be Wednesday, May 12th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. And you can, attendees are asked to register in advance at charlottesville.gov/Zoom. And then more information on the specific project is hosted on a website called fontainestreetscape.com.
Very good, thank you.
That's all.
Mr. Stolzenberg.
Yep, so I had two meetings since we last met. First, the MPO Technical Committee meeting. The big news of that is that we recommended some functional classification changes for some Albemarle County roads. So Avon Street Extended, part of Barracks, and a couple other roads in the county will be reclassified to arterials, which in most cases matches up with what the city half of that has, and will allow them to do entrance corridor review again on those parcels. It also, however, might make moving the city yard a little bit more difficult because our site is along one of those, which means it will now be subject to aesthetic review, which is going to increase the screening requirements for if we were prospectively to move it to that site we own in Albemarle County along Avon. We also got a memo on the upcoming smart scale process. So there's going to be a little bit more involved like community engagement work for smart scale in choosing what smart scale projects we're going to apply with. This was really driven, I think, in large part by some conflict last round, mostly over a Route 20 project that would have put a shared use path right through a grove of trees recently, just a few years ago, planted by the tree stewards. And so as part of that, it was decided after they decided not to submit that project that we needed to do more outreach as part of engagement before deciding what to apply with. And so each project submitted by the MPO is now going to have a project committee, a study committee that will try to think through some of those major issues going forward. And so that will all be starting to begin a little bit later this year. I think advisory committees will be appointed in September. So we also had a place committee meeting again as well. Once again, we talked about the West Main Streetscape project. There's a $6.5 million hole for phase 2 if we want to get that to move forward. There was some discussion about whether we would want to pursue more tactical improvements either in the meantime or in lieu. I think the general sense was that we would, since it still seems like the project is on the table from what City Council is giving us, where we'd rather hold off on those and try to get that $6.5 million filled. Maybe the hope is that if the federal government funds grants for shovel-ready projects, we will have this on hand as shovel-ready, and hopefully we get that filled in there. There was also some discussion about what the future of place will be. Once again, nothing really resolved on that front, but from now on we'll be meeting quarterly until we have a more concrete mission, and potentially establishing subcommittees to study specific projects. Those, I think, oh, actually, there was also a TJPDC meeting as well, where I think we discussed the 29 North Corridor study, where they're going to be studying from the airport all the way up to Ruckersville, the general financial condition, and Christine Jacobs taking over. I think that might have been the month before. I think those were the key items for that one. Oh, also there will be a regional cigarette tax authority now that the counties have the ability to do that. So that's all I got. That's my report.
That's cool. Good report. Thank you. Appreciate that. Reverend Eaton.
Yeah, speaking of shovel-ready projects, I've been in contact with the Rivanna Conservation Alliance, and tomorrow, April 14th, the 15th, and the 16th, they're going to be down at Riverview Park replacing a water access that was washed away. And I'm pretty sure the Parks and Rec Department are involved in advising for that, but I wanted to give a shout out to them and hope that that can be have good community participation as the water and river season comes upon us. And the only other thing I had was to just say that April 15th is fast approaching.
You're stealing my thunder.
Yeah, right. Oh, you did? Okay. And like I said, I just wanted to make commitments through the 15th. If there are things I can be of assistance with after that, I'm not saying I won't, but I just don't want to be held to it.
Yeah, you will. Mr. Solis.
No report.
Mr. Angel's not here. So let's see. Is that me? I think I'm up now. So I missed the last two Parks and Rec meetings. One of the meetings that I missed was Rory's fault, but that's okay, Rory. Because he stopped me in the mall and I got in a conversation with him and didn't go. But and last one I did make, or didn't make, but I sent you guys the PowerPoint from one of the PowerPoints from that meeting. So hopefully you guys got that. But I did make the LUPEC meeting, and there were a number of things happening there, but two things that are important to us, I think. We got our first look at the University of Virginia I'm having a hard to say it. I've always had a hard time. Thinking Commons. The word is thinking commons, like
Contemplative commons.
Contemplative, thank you.
Contemplative.
Thank you. And that's an effort to continue the pursuit of Mr. Jefferson's academical village, where we bring together university life, learning, research, all under an integrated and naturally built environment. This is going to be built near Ridley Hall. Ridley Hall is a school of education, what used to be known as Rugby Hall. And it's going to consume the parking lot in front of the Dell. And it's going to consume the Dell. And it's going to consume the basketball area in the Dell. Good news is the Dell basketball courts are not going away. They're just being moved over to Mem Gym. The Dell is a very important cultural place. It's where UVA students and people who live in Charlottesville come together to play basketball. And I have to admit that I spent, when I was here at UVA, spent more time at the Dell playing ball than I did at Audubon Hall, so Audubon Library. So it's very important that one, it gets moved, but it doesn't go away. They're going to break ground this summer, and they're expected to finish in 2023. So kind of a neat development, and good to know that the Dell, the basketball courts in the Dell, again, where city folks and UVA students come together to play ball. So that's being protected. And it's going to be kind of neat to see Mr. Jefferson's vision of the academical village continue to grow. The other piece is we talked a lot about the East High Streetscape project. And so with that, we've got what's happening there are enhanced and improved and increased bike lanes. We've got improved pedestrian access, and we've got increased signaling, and we've got the undergrounding of utilities. The original cost of this was $5.6 million. After we looked at the cost of the signaling that we thought we needed, and after we looked at the cost of the undergrounding utilities, the price jumped from 5.6 to 11.2 million bucks. So the price went up a bit, but we're looking to move forward with this. We expect to complete this by 2024. The work is about to begin. It's going to begin pretty quickly. So think about the area we're talking about, and think about the work we're going to be doing on the Belmont Bridge. Think about the possibility of a new parking deck, and think about the work that we're going to be doing at Tarleton Oaks. That's going to be a very busy area to traverse during the next 4 or 5 years. So we need to keep that in mind as we develop. Ms. Creasy, NDS, there's your work.
Sure. We continue to work mostly remote. We do have regular visits into the office, and a couple of our staff people are there regularly. We have added Tuesday mornings to drop off. And so we have a drop off on Tuesday mornings as well as the Friday morning drop off. There are a number of discussions at the leadership level concerning transition. And so those discussions have started, and we hopefully will transition back to the office is what I'm noting.
Okay.
We're waiting to hear some of the thoughts on that, but the majority of the city forces have had the opportunity to get into the vaccination cycle if they requested. And so, progress moving forward, we'll just have to wait and see. But in NDS, we consider this a very slow and deliberate process. For those of you who have been in our offices, they are very tight. And so we will be being very, very thoughtful about how we work forward with that. But exciting times, and we're hopeful that we're moving in a good direction. Did want to let you.
By the way, thank you, and your team and city management for including this team in the process. I'm not sure if any of us have taken advantage of it, but being invited to do that was a really nice thing.
I'm glad that folks could be included, and now things are opening up again, or opening up for everyone, and so. Exciting times out there, and hope folks are able to take advantage of that if they're able to. Also wanted to let you guys know that we are not going to host the April work session. In working with Jenny, we're to a point where they won't be ready for a work session then, but we'll be working full force for a session in May. And so Jenny,
would you remind us what was the objective of the April work session that we're next?
It was still under works. We had tentatively put it on the calendar because it's that regular penciled in date that you all already have. Mm-hmm. So when we do coordination meetings, I bring up that date regularly since you all have that penciled already. It's going to be a little bit soon for some of the work that they're doing at this point in time, but we'll be there in May. And so right now I'm gonna turn it over to Jenny for a second to give the Steville Plans Together update, which should have some information, which I know will have some information about our scheduling moving forward, and in preparation for that work session in May, as well as some potential pop-up events that we have during the community engagement process.
Yep. Thanks, Missy. So hello, everyone. First thing I want to note, I'm not sure if Ms. Dowell's on, but we have been coordinating on her request to get demographics from the 2017-2018 process and compare with demographics from our process. We found that there were demographics sort of tracked for the first phase of that process and then for that final survey, that large survey, but not so much for phase 2 and 3, but we'll work on making a direct comparison to what our demographics have been.
Yeah, and if you all remember, the second phase of that was when we were going out to different festivals and Fridays After 5 and other events like that, where we were having very quick interactions with individuals, and not everyone was able to fill out survey materials that we had. So collection of demographics for those events was not as clear as some of the other phases.
Yeah, which we've found in our process as well with some with everything except for the survey. It can be difficult sometimes to track exact demographics, but we're continuing to try to do that whenever we can. Some updates on the progress with the comprehensive plan. We are working through revisions to the future land use map. We really appreciated the good conversation we had with you on the 30th. We have met and are continuing to meet this week with a few groups. We mentioned to you previously, we met with Cadre during the land use framework process, and we met with CLIC earlier this week, the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition, and we'll meet with the HEC and Preservation Piedmont this week as well. So I guess the other piece of this is the chapters. And so as you know, we sent out, we worked with staff on revisions to the topic-specific chapters of the comp plan through the end of March. And then we made revisions based on staff feedback and sent those chapters out last week to you all and to the project steering committee, requesting comments at the end of this week, which we know is a very tight turnaround. And so as we emphasized in our distribution of the chapters, our goal with this phase is to have a draft that has the big ideas in it. And there will be time to work with you all to make sure that we are revising those, getting into the weeds on them as we look at also incorporating community feedback after the community review phase.
Just as in defense of my colleagues, between Thursday and Tuesday of a planning commission meeting, we pretty much are heads down on the feedback we're getting from the public. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to give you the quality feedback that you want by Thursday, because we've been so focused on this, but we'll do the best we can.
That's all I can ask. Thank you. And I think Friday, not that one more day is is a terrible difference, but Friday is I think the deadline we gave. If not, that's certainly what I meant to give. So as Missy noted, we are working toward a phase of public review, and we've been getting feedback on these documents, the map, mostly because it has been out in discussions, but we will be having a concentrated public review phase for both the future land use map and the chapters that will kick off by the end of this month. And I was just in a meeting right before this with our peer engagers, talking with them about the process. And so my hope and the plan right now is that by the end of next week, we can make it clear to you all and to the community what the exact timeline will be moving forward, so people can start marking their calendars. And in general, what we're looking at is several types of activities and outreach about those activities. So through this, we want to make a few things really clear. Making sure it's clear what is the comprehensive plan, reiterating it for those who haven't been involved, that type of thing. How does the comprehensive plan potentially impact individuals or families or neighborhoods? Making it clear how it relates to and implements the affordable housing plan, which we've talked about a lot with folks already. And then just making clear how the future land use map relates to zoning. because we know there's a lot of sort of conflation between the two sometimes, but they are quite tied. So we're working on some specific talking points because we can anticipate some questions we're going to get from the community, and we're working with the peer engagers who can provide a bridge to that as well to help us flag some questions that might come up. As far as how we're going to share materials, we'll have the page on the website. We'll have some webinars and small group meetings, which will likely include some neighborhood associations that we know we've already planned to meet with. And we also will be having in-person pop-ups, pop-up meetings, sort of a COVID-safe in-person option. Looking forward to those. We'll have several ways people can give feedback by email. We'll have an interactive map where people can provide comments on the future land use map. There will also that'll be tied to in-person activities where they can do sort of the analog version of a web map. And we will have a comment submission form on the website, which we're trying to streamline because putting out a large survey is not always the best way to do things, but we want to still give people a way to give us feedback that we can track what feedback we're getting. So those are all things we're in the midst of working through. And like I said, by the end of next week, we hope to have a very specific timeline for those activities.
Good, thank you.
Great, well, thank you all.
So, Mr. Rice, I think we're now ready for matters to be presented by the public that are not on the formal agenda. So if there's anything that you guys would like to chat with us about that isn't on the formal agenda, and that's only the Lynn Hall Apartments, now would be the time to talk to us about that. So things that we are working on. And the critical slope waiver at 915 6th Street Southeast would be an appropriate topic for this moment. So, Mr. Rice, are there any folks in the lobby that would like to speak?
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. If you'd like to address the commission on matters not on the formal agenda, please click your raise hand icon. If you're joining us by phone, press *9. When you are called upon, you'll have 3 minutes for comment. Chair, I see no hands raised.
All right. The consent agenda.
Actually, Chair Mitchell,
Yes.
Ms. Whitehouse just raised her hand.
Ms. Whitehouse, welcome, and please tell us what's on your mind.
Hello, can you all hear us?
We can.
All right, thank you for your time. So we live on Rayon Street here, and really we're just wondering about the, I believe we were provided with a detail of the plans, but I don't recall that had a parking garage. Now there was a parking lot in the detail plan that was provided to the residents here, but now it's a parking garage. Is that correct?
If you're speaking, Ms. Curry, you're muted.
Okay, I was waiting to make sure it was appropriate for me to speak now. There's no parking garage currently shown on the plan, and I've not heard reference to one. So it would still be a surface parking lot behind the building connected to Rayon.
Okay, so we're just trying to understand it. So I'm sorry, I should have identified. We're talking about the 915 6th Street Southeast.
Yeah, thank you.
So
Appreciate it.
there is a building that's there. It's a single family home, and that's going to be leveled and a multifamily put up. Is that right?
Yes.
And then the parking lot would be behind that, and that is what would the access on Rayon Street would be?
Yes.
Okay, I guess then the main concern is just they're talking about 32% of the property is existing critical slope, and when you look over there, it's pretty hard to visualize how only 14% of the critical slope could be disturbed. I mean, the whole thing is a hill, so I guess it's just hard to visualize how there could be a parking lot put there when it's just a hill, and it's not even, you couldn't even park one car there without going down a hill.
Thank you for your input. Thank you. Mr. Rice.
If anybody else would like to address the commission at this time, please click your raise hand icon.
Or if we inadvertently cut him off before his minute ended.
I see no hands raised, Chair.
Okay. The consent agenda.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
There's a motion to approve. Is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any opposition? The consent agenda is approved. And I think we've got one counselor, but we still need to wait another 4 minutes. So we will be in recess for 4 minutes, and then we'll begin, assuming we'll have all the counselors we need. So 4 minutes. Thanks. I didn't even start that until we get there. Way more than a little. no idea. What's going on? Alrighty, good evening. I think we are ready to re-engage. Just hoping that we have enough counselors on. We had, there's Counselor Hill. And I saw Counselor Snook a moment ago. Hello, Counselor Hill.
I'm here as well.
Okay, we got a quorum. Very good. So what counselors are on? We got
Nook, Hill, and Payne.
We have at least 3.
Is Nook here?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Counselor Senior, Counselor Hill, is Counselor in order?
Yes, council is in order. Thank you, Chair Mitchell.
Counselor in order, very good. So before we get into, we're re-engaged and ready to continue our deliberations. But before we do that, I need to, well, talk about something that's just a little sad. We are, it is my task tonight to let you guys know, let council know, council may already know, let my colleagues know, and let the city know that we're about to lose the services of Reverend Heaton. He's been reassigned and will be moving on, and as a result, he will no longer be a member of our deliberative body. And what I'll miss most about him is his very stabilizing and calming voice as we debate, and we do debate quite a bit. And he always keeps the debate steady and focused. So I'm going to miss that because he's made my my life a lot easier than it might have been without him. So to that end, Mr. Stolzenberg has a couple of words he'd like to say about Reverend Heaton.
Yes, so it's my honor to read this resolution from council. Whereas Reverend Gary Heaton served on the Charlottesville Planning Commission from October 2018 to April 2021. And whereas Reverend Heaton served as the Planning Commission representative to the City Manager's Neighborhood Leaders Group and the Citizen Transportation Advisory Committee. And whereas Reverend Heaton used his professional experience with the faith-based community to encourage civic involvement. And whereas Reverend Heaton provided service and leadership to the Planning Commission in preparation for and as well as active participation in committee meetings. And whereas Reverend Heaton has been a participant in the Seville Plans Together effort for the development of an affordable housing plan and the comprehensive plan. And now, therefore, we, the City Council of the City of Charlottesville, do hereby thank Reverend Gary Heaton for his years of dedicated service on the Charlottesville Planning Commission and wish him success in his future endeavors. And I'll join in and say, we'll miss you, Gary. Glad to have you on here, and I hope my new neighbor who moves into your apartment is as good of a neighbor as you are.
Reverend Heaton, anything you'd like to, we're gonna miss you, Dan. Really, I appreciate you so much. Anything you'd like to say?
No, I'm just really honored by the resolution from council. Thank you. And by the fellowship of the members of the Planning Commission, your diligence and your commitment to trying to make our community truly that, a community. And so I've been honored to be able to serve and will be reappointed up into the Northern Shenandoah Valley, and hope to continue some of my civic ministries up there as well.
Well, I really hope you do that, because your input from a spiritual level, and then frankly your background as a planner prior to this benefited us mightily. So hopefully you'll find a way to engage there as well. So thank you, Gary, so much.
Thank you, everybody. Bless you.
All right, I think we are now ready to, council's in order, right? Yeah, we already did that. So we're now ready to talk about the first application, the first and only application. And that application would be SP 21-00003. And this is the Linda Hall Apartments at 64 University Way. And this is a request, an SUP, special use permit request, to increase the density from 21 dwelling units per acre to 48 dwelling units per acre. Specifically, what the applicant would like to do is renovate the existing property in a way that will allow them to expand from the current 9 units per acre, 9 existing units per acre, to 16 units per acre. So it's an expansion by 7 units, from 9 to 16. That's request number 1. The other thing they're asking is that we allow for a reduction in the side yard setbacks. And that reduction in side yard setbacks would allow them to just become to move from a non-conforming situation to a conforming situation. They'd also like us to authorize a reduction in the parking setbacks. And the reduction in the parking setbacks would allow them to actually do off-street parking, which is something the neighborhood has been asking for. And again, Ms. Rainey, I think you're managing this application.
Yes, good evening. Carrie Rainey with Neighborhood Development Services. As mentioned by Chair Mitchell, the applicant is requesting a special use permit to increase residential density to 48 dwelling units per acre. The existing historic building currently houses 9 multifamily dwelling units. Approval of this request would allow 16 multifamily dwelling units. The applicant has proposed that 8 one-bedroom units and 8 two-bedroom units be included, which would result in 24 bedrooms total. The redevelopment manager, who is authorized to review affordable housing requirements, has confirmed the application does not meet the 1.0 floor area ratio, or FAR, per section 34-12A, requiring affordable housing units. The application package indicates no change to the building footprint or massing are proposed. Modifications to the site are focused on the interior of the building, renovation of the exterior facade to align with historic conditions, a new parking lot at the rear of the building, a plaza space at the south of the building, and landscaping additions. The general land use plan calls for the subject property and properties to the north, south, and east to be high density residential land use, with areas directly to the west of the subject property to be low density residential land use. The comprehensive plan specifies that high density residential includes all land to be occupied by multifamily housing types with a density greater than 15 dwelling units per acre. Residential density up to 21 dwelling units per acre, which would be considered high density by the comprehensive plan, is allowed by right in this R3 zoning district. High density residential uses can be considered appropriate in the R3 zone, depending on site specific characteristics and conditions. Several goals in the comprehensive plan also speak to the desire to have density as appropriate in locations that will foster developments that are walkable and bikeable to downtown area and other centers of employment, entertainment, or education. The subject property is less than 1/4 mile from the University of Virginia and within 1/2 mile of the corner shopping district. Creating more density and housing options near these areas may reduce commuter congestion and open up other housing options in other parts of the city. The May 2016 Streets That Worked plan, which is an amendment to the comprehensive plan, labels University Way and other streets in the general vicinity as the local street typology. Local streets are characterized as the majority of the street network and have no specific associated typology due to the variation on context and available space. The Streets That Work plan does note design elements of local streets should not exceed the dimensions specified in the neighborhood B street typology, and that techniques such as curb extensions may be appropriate. A minimum of 5 to 6 feet of clear width for sidewalks is recommended for these streets. And sidewalks and on-street parking are noted as the highest priority elements. University Way is a one-way street with traffic traveling from Lambeth Lane at the University of Virginia border to University Circle, so south to north. The existing sidewalk on University Way is approximately 4 feet in width and includes approximately a 5-foot grass buffer with parallel parking on one side of the street. It would be on the side adjacent to the subject property. No improvements are currently proposed to the public pedestrian and bicycle networks in the current application package. Staff concluded that the existing pedestrian network along the development frontage is not consistent with the Streets That Work plan regarding sidewalk width, but the frontage does include the 2 highest priority items, on-street parking and sidewalks of perhaps subpar width, as well as the planted sidewalk buffer. Section 34881 specifies that one bicycle parking space should be provided for every 2 multifamily dwelling units when deemed appropriate. Per this section, 8 bicycle parking spaces could be required for the 16-unit development. However, the preliminary site plan included in the packet states that 8 bicycle parking spaces will be provided in the basement, and also shows 8 outside bicycle parking spaces, which is a total of 16 bicycle parking spaces in excess of the requirements of section 34881. The bicycle and pedestrian coordinator has recommended that due to the proposed increased density, the applicant should consider providing additional covered secured parking for each bedroom, along with short-term bicycle parking for guests to mitigate the need for parking on site. Staff believes the applicant's proposal to provide 16 bicycle parking spaces, or double the minimum required, will encourage non-vehicular trips to and from the property and should be defined as a condition should the Planning Commission recommend approval. The property is located within District H, Architectural Design Control District, which is the Rugby Road University Circle Venable Neighborhood District. Per section 34-157A7, the Board of Architectural Review has reviewed the special use permit and made the following recommendation on March 16th. The related exterior alterations and rehabilitation will not alter the scale, massing, footprint, or setbacks of the existing building, nor are they inconsistent with the building's design and architectural style. Furthermore, the proposed work, including the exterior rehabilitation, is being coordinated with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. As noted before, the property is located within the R3 multifamily residential district. The description for this district states, for all our multifamily residential district states, the purpose is to provide areas for medium to high density residential development. The basic permitted use is medium density residential development. However, higher density residential development may be permitted where harmonious with the surrounding areas. The R3 district specifically notes that it should be consisting of medium density residential areas in which medium density residential developments, including multifamily uses, are encouraged. Section 34353A requires buildings in the R3 zone to have a side yard setback of at least 1 foot for every 4 feet in building height for developments within the density range of 44 through 87 dwelling units per acre, which is what is requested tonight. With a 10-foot minimum setback on that requirement. As noted by Chair Mitchell earlier, the applicant has requested the side yard setback requirement be modified to simply be 10 feet minimum in allowance with section 34-162A in order to alleviate the non-conformity of the existing building footprint, which is at times located as close as 13.6 feet from the side property line. Staff believes the request to alter the side yard setback requirement is in line with section 34-162 as the modification is desirable due to the location of the proposed use in a non-conforming contributing structure of the District H control district. The applicant also requests modification to the parking standards of section 34-972B6, which requires off-street parking areas to be located no closer than 3 feet to any side or rear property line. The primary site plan included in the package shows the parking area as extending to the property line on the southern, which is side, and eastern, which would be rear sides of the property. The narrative indicates this is necessary for increased parking capacity and maneuvering space. The narrative states the applicant will continue to conform to section 34981, which requires all off-street parking facilities to be drained in a manner to prevent damage to abutting streets and properties and public streets. Staff believes the request to alter the parking standard for off-street parking areas to allow for no minimum offset would be in line with section 34-162, as the modification is desirable due to the location of the proposed use in an existing contributing building on an already developed site. The proposed parking area expansion would provide additional parking to serve the proposed uses per section 34984. And the requested modification does not relieve the proposed off-street parking area of the requirements of section 34981, which again is the drainage requirements. Staff recommends the Planning Commission focus on the following items during review: appropriate density and bedroom counts, recommendations from the Board of Architectural Review, and appropriate allowances for building setback and off-street parking area setbacks. Should the Planning Commission recommend approval, staff recommends they consider the following conditions. Number one, up to 48 dwelling units per acre are permitted on the subject property. A maximum of 16 multifamily residential units with 24 bedrooms shall be allowed on the subject property. Number two, side setback requirements of section 34353A shall be modified per section 34162A to be 10 feet minimum. Number three, off-street parking area offset from the side and rear property line per requirements of section 34972B6 shall be modified per section 34162A to be no minimum setback. Number four, no improvement shall be commenced prior to approval of a final site plan and approval of a permit authorizing land disturbance activities pursuant to section 10.9. For purposes of chapter 10 of the city code, demolition activities shall be planned and built into the erosion sediment control plan and stormwater management plan, if so required, as part of the overall development plan for the subject property, and no demolition activity shall take place as a standalone activity. Number five, the design, height, and other characteristics of the development shall remain essentially the same in all material aspects as described within the application materials received January 21st, 2021 until February 24th, 2021, submitted to the city for and in connection with special use permit request 21-00003, including the site plan dated January 15, 2021. Except as the design details of this development may subsequently be modified to comply with staff comments or by any provisions of these SUP conditions, any change of the development that is consistent with the application shall require modification to the SUP. These characteristics include A, no expansion of the existing building's footprint or height. B, one outdoor patio shall be located on the southern side of the building. C, at least 8 bicycle parking spaces shall be provided in the basement, and at least 8 outdoor bicycle parking spaces shall be provided outside on site. Number 6, outdoor lighting shall be provided at building entrances only. Number 7, all outdoor lighting and lighting fixtures shall be full cutoff luminaires. And number 8, the spillover light from luminaires onto public roads and onto property adjacent shall not exceed 1/2 foot candle. A spillover shall be measured horizontally and vertically at the property line or edge of right of way or easement, whichever is closer to the light source. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and the applicant is also here today to provide a presentation.
So let's go left to right. So Bill, this is in your backyard. Any questions, concerns? I'm sorry, Mr. Ballmer, any questions or concerns?
I don't have too many concerns. I guess during construction, will that sidewalk remain open, or will pedestrian access be routed to the other side of the street? Is that something that we can ask here?
I don't have that information specifically on hand, or if the applicant needs to use the street or sidewalk, close those elements in order to complete construction, they'll be required to obtain a street closure permit from our traffic department. And at that time, the traffic department reviews appropriate access, appropriate routing around, and other elements such as that. So I don't want to speak directly for the traffic engineering department tonight and say exactly what might happen, but they do review and approve to ensure there's appropriate access.
Right, yeah. Okay, yeah, beyond that, I mean, it's great to see all the extra bike parking, and I think pushing them to have as much bike parking as possible is a good thing in that area, because there's a lot of pedestrians and bikers. So really cut down on the vehicles that need to be there.
And Ms. Russell, any questions or concerns?
I had a question that popped in my mind as you were issuing the staff report, and then I went back in the meeting notes and found the answer. And I think that's that the sidewalk does not meet the streets that work criteria in that it's 4 feet wide, and streets that work is 4 to 6. Is that right?
5 to 6 is the streets that work recommendation.
5 to 6, right. So it looks like, you know, there's a planted buffer, there's water lines, there's a retaining wall that's existing on the property. I'm not necessarily proposing that that needs to be widened, but I do kind of see that there's some uneven patches along the sidewalk. Is it at all possible to even just improve the existing conditions as a result of the construction, or request that of the applicant?
To be clear that I understand, is this in reference to only the applicant's frontage or the entire run of University Way?
No, just the front. I'm just looking at the frontage in front of 64 University Way.
Sure, I mean, I think certainly it could be requested, and if the commission finds that the increased density is impactful to the sidewalk condition and requiring wider sidewalk in line with our Streets That Work plan to be proposed, I believe that could be an addition.
I wasn't necessarily going as far as that. I was just commenting on the existing condition of that 4-foot sidewalk that's not level, you know, that are squares out of creating trip hazards kind of thing.
Any comments, Ms. Rainey? Or
Yeah, I think certainly, you know, again, requests can always be made in terms of what can be required. You know, that might, you know, defer to the attorney's office, but in terms of what we're discussing today with the residential density request and the alleviations to the side yards, I think, you know, if we were going to, again, require redoing either the width of the sidewalk or redoing it in order to improve the sloping of the sidewalk, I think we would need to make a connection into the request that's made beyond what our traffic engineering department would review during the site plan process and the requirements that they might place on them.
so I'll, Ms. I'm not sure if Lisa's on or Ms. Robertson's on, but that looks like a proper request, and I'm not sure, Ms. Robertson, are you here? We can do a proper request here.
Yeah, I think that's a proper request.
I'm sorry. Is Ms. Robertson on? Or Ms. Creasy could probably help us with this as
I
well.
think that's a proper request.
Okay, so we should not do that. Then we should avoid that.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's okay to make that request?
Yeah.
Have the rules changed? I didn't think we could, from the dais, make proper requests.
Am I misunderstanding? Tell me again what you're trying to do.
Liz, because I think I like where you're going with this. So Liz, would you please, I'm sorry, Ms. Russell, would you please help Ms. Robertson walk her through what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so I note from the staff report that the sidewalk does not meet the requirements of Streets That Work criteria in that it's narrower, right? It's 4 feet wide. And I am not proposing that we ask the applicant to change that, given that it's just a tight spot. But I am observing, you know, a sort of deteriorated condition of the existing sidewalk. Minor, just, you know, a few concrete squares like out of alignment. I don't know how to describe that. Things that need to be just either re-poured or
yeah.
Right. I'm just asking, is it possible that the existing conditions be improved to that sidewalk so that it's, you know, easier for people with mobility issues to use?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think that, so are you talking about the sidewalk that's right in front of, is there sidewalk right in front of the property?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think one could argue that by putting additional people in that area, long story short, if it's a public sidewalk, the city should be maintaining it, unless the use of the property itself is going to create some different impact on the sidewalk than normal. So, probably construction activities or that sort of thing are not going to have an impact on the existing sidewalk. But so I'm sorry, I misunderstood the original request. I thought it was something different. But no, I don't think there's anything that I see in this particular proposal that demonstrates that the applicant instead of the city should be maintaining or should bring the sidewalk into good repair.
Okay. Still a good question. Okay.
Okay, well, you clarified something for me, which was that I thought that property owners were responsible for their own sidewalks, so.
Not if it's a public sidewalk, and most sidewalks are public sidewalks. So we should probably, if that one's in poor repair, we should probably make sure that Public Works has it on a list somewhere to be repaired.
It's a minor thing from what I can see. I just was in the thinking of while there was work going on, could it be improved? But thank you. For
yeah, it all depends on sort of the nature of the work and the impact. So in this case, unless something unique about the construction work or the use of the property itself is going to require an update or expansion or repair of the sidewalk, it's something generally that we can't have the property owner be responsible for.
Got it. So I've lost, because Joe wanted off, we lost control of our clock, but let's, we'll come back if there's more, but let's go on to Rory. Rory, you got any questions, concerns?
Yes. So to be clear, are there 14 parking spaces provided?
There are currently 14 parking spaces proposed to be provided. As noted in the staff report, the applicant is currently noting a reduction allowance for the proximity of bus stops, which is allowed in our code. However, the code specifically states city bus stops, and the bus stop in proximity is a UTS or University Transit Services bus stop. So that staff believes that provision would not be applicable. However, there's other reduction allowances in our parking standard code in terms of, for example, lockable bike storage that can be provided to further reduce the parking count. So that's a comment that's made in the preliminary site plan review, but it, is something also being worked out at this time.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I will say it's kind of ludicrous that in the code we exclude those university bus stops, which are much higher frequency and in this case has far more routes on it. But obviously that doesn't apply. So I see that we have for bike parking required 12 bike rack spaces required, and then as one of our conditions / in the plan we have 8 lockable bike spaces and then 4 racks. So to me that would seem to get a 1 space reduction, or actually, first of all, does that get any production or reduction given that it's 12 provided and 12 required? And then second half of that question is like, can they be double counted, I guess is what I mean. And then the second half of that question is, wouldn't we need 2 more lockable spaces or indoor spaces in order to satisfy that 2 space reduction, since it's 5 bike storage spaces per parking space?
So for question 1, there's actually 16 bicycle parking spaces proposed. So a bike rack holds two bicycles. So the 4 racks that are outside would give us 8 spaces on the outside, and then 8 spaces in the basement of the apartment. And you're correct that regarding the numbers for the bicycle lockers on site, that 1 space shall be allowed for reduction per every 5 lockers provided. So as part of the site plan review process, the applicant has to meet our certain standards and conditions, our code sections. So through that process, they could propose to add additional bike lockers in order to meet that requirement and allow the step back in parking, or they might propose other systems or other work and other other options to further reduce that parking or otherwise provide that parking in some other way. So I believe the conditions as written now, provides that minimum that they've already shown on the site, but they can certainly provide more if they need to in order to meet their parking requirements. So there'll be an impetus on them during the site plan review process to ensure, and for staff to approve the actual plan, that parking's provided for. So they have options. So through the special use report analysis and conditions, I did not recommend placing a particular parking reduction option on them, especially since they haven't proposed the bike locker one at this time. But you are correct in your statements.
Okay, so they can either add extra bike storage beyond what's provided here, or pursue another option if that's available. Or there's the requesting a parking waiver as part of the SUP, but they haven't asked for that and don't want that. And could we give them that? I mean, I can't imagine a more appropriate place for it.
I mean, the applicant has not specifically requested that. Certainly during their time to speak, they might want to speak to whether they'd be interested in that. And it could, planning commission and council could provide an allowance there. I would defer to Mrs. Robinson about whether, for the purposing of this hearing and the materials noticed, whether additional work would need to happen in terms of public hearings in order to include that piece. But it could, it is something that is allowed through our special use permit.
Okay, thanks.
Reverend Heaton. Anything new, Gary?
I don't have any questions.
And Mr. Soliers.
Mr. Palmer will correct me, but I believe the university exists. So UTS bus stops are indeed excellent. Is it worth a zoning text initiation to acknowledge their existence?
So before we answer that, how does that relate to this application? Because I'm missing.
Currently, this application is bound by code that pretends that the university doesn't exist. The university exists.
In particular, the university transit service.
Yes, yes.
So again, help me focus. As it relates to this application, does that impact this application, or should we? I'm sorry.
Yes, 2 spaces. That would eliminate the requirement for a reduction or other allowance if our code acknowledged the existence of the university, which exists.
Okay. I'm having trouble focusing on this. How does that impact this application?
Our code affects this application.
Are you suggesting we change the code to support this application?
I'm suggesting that as an option, if that makes sense, and I don't know.
Well, that's not an option tonight, no.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I was like a little out of scope. Yeah, the question I was asking, but good question, Mr. Soliates. I totally agree, but good point. And maybe that's something we should consider, but under a separate umbrella.
That makes sense. Otherwise, excellent presentation, very clear. Thank you.
Cool. If there are no other questions, I'm going to invite the applicant to present.
I have one small question for the applicant, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Relating to stormwater, not really stormwater, water. This really ugly gutter looks like it's piping directly to the adjacent alleyway, kind of a sidewalk. I'm just curious if that's being addressed or will continue to be what looks like a nuisance.
Is that a question for the applicant, or is that a question for the
I think it's likely for the applicant as part of their.
Okay, let me invite the applicant to present. We'll let them present. That's a good question for them. So the applicant, would you like to kind of walk us through what your vision for this is? And then we'll ask questions.
Yes, thank you for your time. My name is Chris Henningsen. I'm with Henningsen Kestner Architects, and we represent Neighborhood Properties, who's the owner of the property. This building is a contributing structure in the Rugby Road Historic District, and was built in 1915 as a 12-unit apartment building specifically for students at a time when most students were living in boarding houses where meals were provided. So as a result, it's kind of quirky, but the original apartments did not have kitchens. There was a communal dining room located in the basement and a commercial kitchen in the basement, which are now not in use. There was a renovation made to the building, I believe in 1936, which combined several of the units so that kitchens could be added. The former communal dining room was carved up into 2 new apartments in the basement. And the commercial kitchen is actually still down in the basement, used as storage. So when you enter the building, there are still 4 doors for the original 4 apartments on each landing of the stairwell. And the conclusion was made by a historic preservation consultant that was engaged to look at the project, that we could actually preserve more of the original walls and doors in the building by returning the 2 3-bedroom apartments on each level back to the original 4-unit configuration in the building. So bringing the upper 3 floors back to its original 12-unit configuration, and then converting the basement into 4 additional units with a similar layout to what's above, just so that we can stack structural elements, plumbing, and that kind of stuff. So that's how we've arrived at the 16-unit configuration that we're asking for. The units are going to be 1 and 2 bedroom units, and by right, you could get 7 units in the building, and I think I'm hoping that we're approved for our request. But I think if we're not, the alternative is that we would be kind of, creating 7 4-bedroom units in the building, which would actually result in 4 more bedrooms overall than what we're proposing. So doing that would be kind of regrettable, because we're really trying to preserve as much of the interior walls and doors as we possibly can. So I think the alternative kind of by right situation in this building would be, kind of regrettable for that reason. The additional aspects of the SUP that we're asking for, the side yard setback reduction, is just an acknowledgement of the existing condition of the building. It's kind of been that way, as far as I know, since 1915. The parking actually is currently a paved parking lot in the backyard. It does go all the way to one of the property lines currently. So once again, we're asking for this as part of the SEP to just formalize that existing condition and allow us to expand on the other side. And that side is another apartment building, which is actually owned by the same owner. And to speak to the drainage question, I'm not sure exactly how that drainage is being handled, but since the two properties are owned by the same owner, I think it's, drainage on the site. It's easy to, kind of fix that situation. Drainage from this site is just draining onto another site, which is also going to be improved and just doesn't require an SUP for that project. As far as the parking count, the parking reduction that we wanted to use was based on proximity to a bus line, and that was, I have to admit, an oversight on our part that the university bus lines did not count for that parking reduction. So if you're able to grant a straight reduction of 2 spaces as part of this without us having to reapply, that would really be appreciated. And if not, I think we'll figure out how to get the reduction by other means. I think bicycle parking is already part of the job. So, it's not, I think increasing that is, if we can get the parking reduction by that method, we'll do that. But if it could be granted as part of this SUP, that would be even better. There's still going to be bicycle parking on site. As far as the exterior changes, what you're going to see from the street is really just a restoration of the existing building, repointing the brick, restoring all the windows. There's some kind of shoddy railings up at the 3rd floor level that are going to be restored back to an original kind of Chippendale pattern. On the rear of the building, there are 2 kind of deteriorating and pretty ugly fire escapes that we are proposing to remove and replace them with porches of approximately the same square footage, just for resident use. Since we're going to be adding a full sprinkler system to the building, the fire escapes are not needed for emergency egress. So I'm happy to answer any other questions, but I think that kind of is what we're asking for in a nutshell.
All right, any questions for the applicant? Let's begin with UVA. Any questions, Bill? Any questions?
Just to say, I don't think I have any further questions. Thanks.
Okay, Ms. Russell?
No further questions.
Ms. Stolzenberg?
I have a couple questions. So first, you just told us the by right use that you would be pursuing if we were to deny this SUP is for 7 4-bedroom apartments or 28 bedrooms. And so to me, that sounds like that produces 4 more beds worth of housing to house 4 more students, which is potentially an entire house in 10th and Page that wouldn't be occupied by students. So why is that regrettable from my perspective?
I think that would involve us having to remove enough of the existing fabric of the interior of the building that this project qualifies for historic preservation tax credits. We've already been through an entire review process by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and the National Park Service, who have approved the proposed plans that we want to do. And I think for that reason, and not just because of the tax credits, but just because that would kind of just remove more of that existing interior fabric of the building. So I think, normally I'm all for more density, but I think in this case, the historic nature of the property and kind of the owner's desire to preserve it in as close to its existing condition as we can get it is a consideration in this case.
And Jody's not here, but I'll speak for him. This would give him great heartburn. So.
Okay. I guess I was always under the impression that we cared more about the exterior of the building than interior walls. But I'll take that. My next question, or sorry, Mr. Russell.
In a tax credit project, they're looking at interior as well.
Oh, okay, good to know. Thanks. So with regard to the change in the parking layout along the border of like the rear property line with 515 Rugby, actually a house I lived in for several years. I know there are several trees along that boundary line that aren't shown in your site plan. And in the existing conditions plat on page 42 of our packet here, you can see that kind of the third space and the fourth space from the left or from the north are kind of bumped out, and they're a little bit shorter than a standard parking space size. And I believe that's because that's where the tree is, or at least one of the trees. And then in your final site plan or your after conditions, those are all 16-foot long parking spaces going right to the line. So are you planning to remove those boundary line trees?
I don't think there are plans to remove those trees. I have not discussed it specifically with the civil engineer, but as far as I know, there's no plans to remove the trees in the rear there. I think the one tree that you're referring to where the parking spot bumps out is a pretty old tree, and it'd be a shame to get rid of it. But I don't think that's really part of the plan.
Yeah, I'd agree to be a shame. And so I see that your engineer is on the call. Would you like to address that?
Sure. Yes, the plan is to keep these trees right there, that corner that exists. We're not bumping the parking lot out any more than it's already shown on the existing conditions, except for one spot, like a foot or two. But we're planning on keeping the trees, yes.
Okay, thanks. And so I guess this is where I'd be asking Jody whether the tree would be safe with, I mean, it seems like maybe the parking spaces are going to be on top of it a little bit more, which could compact the tree roots. Is that right? Or the limit of it the same?
The limits of that and that location are the same.
Okay. I mean, again, it doesn't quite look like that on those pages of the plan. I can give you your internal pages, sheet number 1 and number 2 of the existing conditions for the existing conditions and demolitions plan is where that bump out is that I see.
That's correct.
And you're saying it's paved all the way to the line, like it's showing in the.
Yeah, when you overlay it, there's a 3-foot grass strip that's going to be preserved. Actually, the sheet 1 sort of shows the overlay of the existing pavement with the new. And I think it's probably within 6 inches of in that corner, very corner where the tree is. So it's what you're seeing, that hatching beyond the parking is more of a natural grass or existing conditions type buffer.
Okay, that's good to know. And so then I guess since you guys have just asked for a potential parking space reduction, would now be an appropriate time to ask Ms. Robertson if that's feasible?
Would you repeat the questions so that we could all?
To add a parking space waiver for that extra space that they're not going to be able to get a reduction because of the proximity to the bus stop, because it's not a city bus stop.
Seems to me that could be we've got the conditions that we've been given on page 15 and 16. Maybe that could be just an added amendment to the conditions. You cool with that?
Agree that the city code allows the
city council in reviewing an application for a special use permit to modify, reduce, or grant exceptions to parking standards. So it would be fine for you to recommend that, even though it hasn't specifically been requested. The language of the ordinance in that particular section will allow that to be done by city council, you know, on your recommendation if they would like to.
So what I recommend, again, if when we make a motion, we move, if we get there, to accept the conditions recommended by staff on page 15 and 16, and then add that additional bullet at the back end. That cool? Okay.
Sounds great to me. Thanks.
Mr. Soliates.
Did you see any issues with the restrictions read earlier by staff? Lighting has been an issue before. People have big feelings about lighting. Any issues you see?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think some of the conditions are kind of a result of the parking situation that we have. So if we could get the parking reduction, it would be nice if people didn't have to carry bikes down to the basement, you know, and we maybe provide more bike racks outside. Even there's an existing covered area under the side porches of the building where we could locate some bike racks that would be covered. So that would give us a little bit of flexibility in terms of being able to meet the bike parking requirements. But I think everything else, lighting and all the other conditions that I read seem reasonable, and I think we can meet them.
Thank you.
Okay. Council, any questions for staff or the applicant?
I don't have any.
Likewise.
And have been answered. Thank you.
Okay. Any further deliberations on our part, or are we ready to make a recommendation to council?
You gotta do public comment. That's why we're here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Missy. Heather. So yes, thank you. So now we are ready to open this up to public comment. So if you'd like to make a comment on the application, please raise your hand and Mr. Rice will recognize you. And again, Ms. Hill, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. And we do have one hand raised. Karen Dugald. Karen, you're on with the Planning Commission.
Welcome, Ms. Dugald. You may be muted. Ms. Dugald, I think you're muted.
Ms. Dugald, are you able to unmute?
Okay, go ahead.
There we go. There she is.
Are you hearing me now?
We can. Thank you.
Okay. As a resident of University Circle for 46 years, we have seen quite a change in the traffic on this circle, much due to the situation of Lind Hall and Jack Jewett apartments increasing the number of students living there. We also realize that it's wonderful thinking students will have their bicycles, but I would say 95% of the rentals on the circle all have cars. And this is going to create a very dangerous situation. The students who live in the apartments on University Way are not supposed to go down to the one-way University Way street, but they do because it's much faster to go the wrong way. As a result, the ones who do follow the rules go very, very quickly around the circle, which has a rather dangerous curve in it. We are finding we are having more young families moving on the circle. And right now we have 3 really little ones. And the speed and the number of cars that are whipping around the circle is a big concern because a number of them are going to Lind Hall or the Jack Jewett apartment. And although you have bicycle spaces, we own one apartment on the circle, and we have learned that cars are so important to these students as soon as they're second years and allowed to have a car. So having only 13 parking spaces, I don't know what the street parking situation is, whether University Way can only park on University Way or if they are on University Circle parking. But the increased traffic worries us. And then we truly want to know from the owner, and we can't really get a good answer, how many residents are currently living in Lind Hall and how many will be allowed to live in Lind Hall? Because even though it's a 2-bedroom apartment, they can squeeze a bunch of kids in there like sardines, and we don't know. I know square footage is applicable in the number that can be there. So the number currently there, how many can be there, the lack of parking spaces for cars, great for bicycles, but cars are a problem in our little congested, and we feel very special place in Charlottesville. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, are there other folks?
Anybody else would like to address the commission at this time?
And if you don't
please
mind,
click your raise hand
when you get
icon.
a chance, would you start the clock as well?
Oh, sorry about that, Chair Mitchell. You're right. Thank you. Anybody else? Next up, we have Matthew Shetlick. Matthew, you're on with Planning Commission.
Evening, Matthew. Welcome.
Good evening. I am also a neighbor on University Circle, and thank you, Karen, for speaking up. I think I have a more generic question or comment for what it's worth. Basically, we're having, I guess, it's an unusual year for everyone. Okay, so we're there's a lot of forbearance one would expect from in a neighborhood when the kids are cooped up and let out a bit. But with this particular landlord, we're aware that they own 3 or 4 buildings immediately adjacent to this one in question. I think it's great that they're renovating an old building. I bought a house on University Circle to renovate an old building, and I think it's a wonderful thing. We're enjoying it. But at the same time, their policies, procedures, ways of working are leading to some, I would say, uncomfortable outcomes, uncomfortable events on the street. And so more is not exactly seen as better. So to touch into Karen's comment, it's very important for us to understand density, not because we don't want fewer people living here, but with this particular landlord, with this particular ways of working with respect to how they engage students, bring them in. It's only students. And by the way, I have students at University of Virginia. There are no bicycles being ridden. I walk every day with the students, with my dog, see the students. There's no bikes being ridden. So don't worry about that, guys. It's not important, even though it's in your statutes. The issue is cars. The issue is in behavior and density. And so for us, it's more about how many are going to be there and how they're going to behave and how they're going to engage with the neighborhood. This is about a community. It's a nice community here. We love having the students. We opted in. And so it's really important that we answer the question of how many kids are going to be here, and is there going to be some sort of change in how, once the physical plan is dealt with, and I'm sure it's going to be beautiful because the existing condition is, you know, it's seen better days, and any improvements welcome. But once the kids get there, how are they going to be expected to behave, I think is more of an issue, a real issue in this community. Not been addressed, obviously, because you guys are kind of dealing with the swim lanes you're in, but that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. A few incidents recently, we engaged with the University of Virginia about behavior of the students. And it's interesting how it sort of aligns with certain landlords. that accept certain kinds of behavior. The partying, the noise, bottle throwing, glass on the streets, that sort of thing. So we're actually interested in quality of life here because we live here. And if we want to narrow it down to, after those generic comments, how many kids are going to be here and how they're going to behave is really of interest. And cars, yes, because they're tearing around the block right now. I'm sitting out here right now watching the cars go by. So if they can answer that question, that'd be helpful.
Thank you, Michael. We probably are not going to get into a back and forth dialogue because we're not in a work session, but your comments have been noted and we'll take them into consideration. Mr. Rice.
And if anybody else would like to address commission at this time, please click your raise hand icon. I see no other hands.
Right. With that, we will close the public comment section and open it up to deliberations with the commission. Thoughts about a recommendation to council? And I'll open up generically. Oh, the one thing I didn't do this. Sorry, guys. Before I open up to you guys, I want to make sure council gets a chance to ask the applicant and or the staff any questions they might have.
The only question that I've got is one that I'm not really sure is something that the Planning Commission can do much about. I've been hearing from a number of neighbors about their concerns with the behavior of the people, mainly students, I assume, who live in a lot of these apartments on University Way and University Circle. And in particular, the complaints have been about mask wearing and not mask wearing and parties where people are not observing all of the required protocols. I just wonder whether there is anything that we as a city can profitably do to try to enforce some behaviors in that area, recognizing that that's one of the costs of the density that we are trying to encourage in some of these neighborhoods. If we're encouraging the density and we don't have any mechanism or are not willing to exert any mechanism for controlling the adverse effects of that concentration of people, that's as much a neighborhood problem as not enough parking spaces.
So 3 thoughts. Thought number 1, worthy concern. Thought number 2, I'm not sure what the Planning Commission can do. Thought number 3, didn't understand your use of the word profitably do. You said profitably do.
Well,
I don't understand what you meant by that.
Maybe not profitably in the sense of we return economic value to ourselves, but usefully, or I don't want to be spinning wheels. I don't want to be doing things that are ineffectual.
Yeah.
And I frankly don't know what the effectual means would be. It's on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, maybe we get the university and the interfraternity council or whatever other entities there may be to take some greater role. But when I talk about that with the neighbors, they kind of laugh at me and say, yeah, we've tried that. Come on.
Yeah.
So I throw it out there, hoping that someone will have some wisdom for us and for staff, and maybe somebody will have some thoughts for us. Doesn't affect this vote particularly, but that's the real problem in that neighborhood is frankly more the behavior of some of the people than the number of them. Anyway,
I'm not sure that I can offer wisdom, but I can offer the 10th and Page experience, which it has some similarities to the Venable experience, which is the MyCville app. It's amazing. Put stuff in the MyCville app. The city will do their absolute best. Doesn't mean they can do everything. We're still limited by code and staffing, but it does help, and you can actually see what's logged and keep up with it.
And I won't say it's a recommendation, but I can offer a possibility from history. I recall about 10 years ago, at the behest of neighbors on University Circle, council nearly passed an ordinance making noise violations a potentially jailable offense. So that would be a legal option open to you, though I don't personally think it's a good idea. And I have to ask Councilor Snook, are you suggesting that the nature of living in apartments is what causes people to party? Or something else? But I mean, it would seem to me that this behavior, if it exists, is probably a function of them being undergraduate students. And if we didn't have them densely in a historically student area, like say University Circle, then they would be spreading out, as Commissioner Soliate said, into our neighborhoods, traditionally non-student neighborhoods like 10th and Page, and participating in the same behavior, I would think.
So before we sink into a long dialogue about this is getting beyond the scope of the this special use permit application. And if I can bring us back to the focus on this singular application, we can have another conversation later in another venue. But are there any questions from council for the applicant and or staff on this SUP?
Questions have been answered. Thank you.
Likewise, don't have any questions that haven't already been raised.
Okay. Commissioners, are there any thoughts about a recommendation to council on this SUP?
No questions.
Any thoughts? Any?
I have a question from staff. My understanding is that this is permit parking, and students living in apartments can take up no on-street parking by our current ordinance. So do I understand that correctly?
That is correct. The traffic engineer has confirmed that no residents that would reside in this building would be eligible to receive the on-street parking permits.
And so along those lines, and the one nuisance that it is within the Planning Commission purview to address, cars specifically, my experience, both as a student some years ago and in all the research that I've read, is that cars are something of an induced effect. If you have somewhere to store your car, you will bring a car. If you have nowhere to store your car, and even the on-street parking available to most citizens isn't available to you, because we treat certain citizens differently under the law, you won't have a car because you have nowhere to put it. And so it would seem to me that it would be in the public interest to minimize the parking on this site, both in terms of, as we said, the reduction that would just make sense simply because of the bus stop nearby, but for the wording of our ordinance, and potentially more reduction. In fact, I would love to see an addition to the rear of the property to add more housing, but obviously isn't in the scope of what we're seeing today. So to me, it would make sense to add that parking waiver as a part of this SUP. And I do think we should hammer out exactly what that looks like, because it sounds like it's either 1 or 2 spaces are needed to make that 14 space work, depending on whether the 8 storage spaces qualify as 1 unit reduction for 5 of them. Is that right, Ms. Rainey? Or would that be double counting against the requirement?
No, so the currently proposed bicycle parking in the basement, you're asking if that could be used for a reduction in the vehicular parking count, correct?
That's right, yeah.
To make sure I understood. So they could be counted for that parking reduction. The lockers or the inside bicycle spaces would need to meet our code section, which states specifically bike lockers. So generally we're talking about something that's enclosed, that's lockable, indoors obviously, but so it would have to meet the criteria of that parking reduction section in terms of being, in this case, being a lockable box, as it were, that you could use. As you mentioned earlier, they're only proposing 8 spaces in the basement right now. So in order to get 2 vehicular parking space reduction, they would need to have 10 lockable secured bicycle lockers within the basement.
But so with 8, they'd qualify for 1 space reduction. So then if we recommended a further 1 space reduction as a waiver in the SUP, that would be sufficient?
Oh,
Assuming
yes,
that
I'm
they're
sorry, that's
lockable?
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And is the plan for the applicant, is the plan for those to be lockable and qualify as lockers?
Right now, I would have to find the space in the basement for bike lockers. We have the exterior bike lockers, and then in order to get the parking reduction, if we have to go that route, we'll figure out how to get them in the basement. Personally, I think having them in the basement where people have to carry a bike down to the basement's not a great, you know, situation. I think it would be better if we had more bike parking, you know, outside the building, even in a covered area that we have to the side. But whatever we have to do to get the parking reduction, that's, you know, we'll figure out how to do that.
So I agree that carrying them downstairs is a hassle, but also having them secure is important. Are you aware that a recommended condition is to have 8 bicycle parking spaces provided in the basement?
Yes, yeah, I am. And I was under the impression that that was a result of the our kind of planned parking reduction, proximity to a bus stop, you know, not working. So I thought that was added.
And so the reference in the reports to the 8 space in the basement is from the preliminary site plan. If you're looking at sheet 1 of that, which is attachment C of the report, under item 19 in the project data, it says provided parking. It notes 8 spaces in the basement and 4 bicycle racks. So that's where the condition I proposed came from, the reference to that.
Okay, I see that.
So what would the commission like to do with this application?
May I just raise one question? So Carrie, I just want to make sure with the talk about reduction of parking standards, I just want to make sure everyone's aware. I don't know, think the traffic engineer and Ms. Rainey have looked at this issue, but I don't know what changing the actual number of required parking spaces would be. But in the permit parking ordinance, there are provisions that talk about how you calculate whether or not a multifamily dwelling can receive permits, and if so, how many. And one of the 2 ways of calculating it is to take the minimum off-street parking requirement and subtract the actual number of off-street parking spaces available for the dwelling. And then the second method you look at is you apply a certain percentage of the total number of on-street parking spaces and compare that to the street frontage for that particular location. So I just want to know whether, if the actual parking requirements are reduced, whether that would yield a different result in the conclusion that the building would not be eligible for permit parking passes.
So when I discussed this project with the traffic engineer previously, and we looked at that section, we had discussed that in section 34985, which is our rules for computing required spaces, item B is certain reductions in the number of required parking spaces for a particular use should be allowed. So by our reading of that section, and this is referring more, we were looking at it from the perspective of both the city bus stop, the bus stop potential reduction, as well as bicycle lockers on site being provided as a reduction. So we believe that read as you can reduce the number that you're required to provide to, for example, 14 in this case, by doing these other options, in which case 14 would be your required parking space. Again, this mind backwards in my mind. That would be compared to in the permit parking section to say that, you know, they're only required to have 14 and they're providing 14 as an example, was how I believe the discussion was, you know. With the
so that comes out to be 0.
That was the way we were reading it, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that there's a calculation involved in the permit parking section of the code, and it relates to the number of spaces required by the ordinance. So I just want to make sure everybody is aware of that.
And the spaces you're talking about are off-street or on-street parking spaces? Off-street.
Off-street, yeah.
So it looks like we're angling towards a consensus on the number of units to be built. It looks like we have a general consensus on the backyard, side yard setback. The final debate is on the setback for parking. Is that, am I reading that right?
I actually had a motion.
Huh?
I actually had a motion, if I may.
That would be helpful.
I move to recommend approval of this application for a special use permit in the R3H zone at 64 University Way, tax map 5, parcel 48, to permit residential development with additional density and modification to side yard setbacks and parking standards, with the listed conditions in the packet and the addition of exempt 2 required parking spaces due to proximity to University Transit Service, and removing the words "in the basement" from condition 5C.
I think I can live with any concerns with the motion? Any amendments?
Well, so I would second the motion. So in order, but I would wonder if we would want to change 5C then to require that some of those bicycle parking spaces, those 8, be fewer or lockers.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that? Rory, would you
given the change from the basement? So right now it's 8 spaces in the basement and at least 8 outdoor spaces. If we strike "in the basement," then it's at least 8 spaces and at least 8 outdoor spaces. So I might say at least 8 secure bicycle parking spaces and at least 8 outdoor bicycle parking spaces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, semantics, but what do my colleagues think? I think that gets the job done. What do you guys think? So that's a friendly amendment to Lyle's recommendation, yes?
I guess the question is whether we want to require they be secure or if we allow 16 outdoor insecure spaces.
My humble opinion is that we want them to be secured. But what do my colleagues think?
Are we talking about secure outside? Because then we're kind of getting into what our colleagues in architectural design review weighed in on, right? Or am I?
Yeah, and the one thing I don't want to do is I do not want to contradict anything they did, because
I think the main change to me, if we were to say secure, is that they could be in the basement or they could be secure on the first level or whatever.
So the word secure means they can be anywhere as long as they're secure. 16 spaces secure.
8 of them would be secure, yeah.
Ms. Randy, are you comfortable with that?
I think generally I would ask if a phrase such as lockable would be appropriate to use. You know, I think secure can potentially mean different things for different people. So when we get into the site plan review phase and we're ensuring compliance of various conditions that may be placed on this project, that secure could, you know, it could mean lockable. It could mean everybody can access it in the building. Once they're in the building, it could mean individual. You know, there's a bit more, I think, play there. I think it's fine.
So you like the word lockable to be, lockable is a better word.
If I could suggest a new 5C, we could say at least 8 bicycle lockers, to use the same phrase as the ordinance, as well as, in addition to, at least 8 outdoor bicycle parking spaces provided on site. And that way, it's the same as in the ordinance, and I really don't want it to be ambiguous. The first 8 are different from the second 8.
All right, but Ms. Rainey's concern is the units outside need to be lockable. So the word lockable also needs to.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't clear. I was referring to what I assume would be interior bicycle parking spaces that's being discussed. The 8 inside was being changed from 8 in the basement to just 8 secured spaces. So they could still, I think it's still fine to say that, or to say, 8 lockable bicycle spaces within the building if you wanted it to be interior, if that's an important point to keep. The 8 spaces on the outside, the bike racks, those are generally utilized by individual bike lots by people that are using them. So I don't personally think there needs to be any modification to the text for the 8 outdoor bicycle spaces, but I think in reference to what is currently indoor spaces, in which it sounds like, depending on where y'all land, it might either be they still need to be inside the building, or perhaps they could move elsewhere, but they would need to be secured or lockable in some sort of way.
Okay, so Mr. Sully Yates, you've got it cut and pasted into your motion. Would you read the motion again and see if it works?
I would be honored. At least eight bicycle lockers shall be provided, and in addition, at least eight outdoor bicycle parking spaces shall be provided outside on site.
And to be clear, no matter how this ends up, it goes through the BAR for a certificate of appropriateness, right? Because it's in a historic district.
So generally, yes. The preservation planner, Jeff Warner, has noted as a part of this process, I'm trying to pull up the right reference, that there are conditions in which administrative staff review of certificates of appropriateness can be given. So certainly they need to achieve a certificate of appropriateness, whether administratively with Mr. Warner or with the Board of Architectural Review, depending on their path.
So, yes.
Yes.
Great. And then if we're good on the bikes, I would suggest that perhaps we don't want to have condition 5B, 1 outdoor patio shall be provided on the southern side of the building. I understand it's in part to satisfy the amenity requirement of R3, but how they satisfy that, I don't think is incredibly our concern, given that it's a private amenity for the residents of this building. And it sounds like the neighbors don't particularly want the residents of the building to recreate outdoors. And so there doesn't seem to be a compelling public interest in requiring that patio, but of course they can build it if they want it, and they do seem to be planning to. So I would move to amend to strike condition 5B.
Isn't the patio proposed to be located in between or adjacent to the neighboring apartment? Then I would think that that actually creates sort of a purpose-built place for congregating. That's not like spilling over into the streets. I mean, people are not gonna prevent people from people are gonna party, right? But at least providing it in a place that is appropriate, as appropriately as possible on the site, would seem like a benefit.
I'd have to agree with Ms. Russell that, I don't see any reason to strike that. But
Personally, I see no trouble with it either way.
I don't feel strongly enough to argue the point. I feel fine.
all right, so we have a motion by Mr. Sully Yates. Is there a second?
A second.
Ms. Creasy, do you understand the motion? Is Ms. Creasy with us? Mr. Acapulco, do you understand the motion?
I'm here, and I understand the motion.
Okay, cool. It's been moved and probably second. Ms. Creasy, will you poll the commission?
Sure. Mr. Alejandro. Oh, he's not here. Mr. Sully Yates.
Yes.
And Ms. Dowell's not here either. Mr. Heaton.
Yes.
Mr. Stolensberg.
Aye.
Ms. Russell.
Yes.
And Mr. Mitchell.
Aye. All right, we will recommend approval of the SUP to the council. Do you guys need a break or do you want to power through the steep slope? I think the steep slope will involve more conversation, but what do you guys want to do? 5-minute break or power through?
I could power through.
I'm seeing people doing this, so let's take 3 minutes. 3 minutes, come right back. And council, I think this will be interesting to you, but if you want to,
We have to stay, don't we?
this is not a public hearing,
No.
Oh.
but it's kind of interesting though.
Oh, it's interesting. I've been over there.
Hang around.
We'll be here. I'll be here.
Hang around, guys. Okay, 3 minutes. See you in a minute. Wow. 3 minutes goes by quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, man. And again, thank you for leading us through that and getting us to a decent conclusion, I think.
Honored.
And we're waiting for Let's see, and Lisa's back, and Gary's back, and Gary's back, and Roy's back. I think that's all we need. I'll give Missy, are you going to be back, or are you online, or? And Alex, are you online?
I'm here.
Okay, you're back. Okay, cool. Great.
Mhm.
All right, the next item is not a public hearing item, but it is still an important item. It is the critical slope item. And I'm going to ask Ms. Carey to remind us of what our focus ought to be, because this is not a special use permit. This is not a rezoning issue. This is really, our focus needs to be on, I think, and Ms. Carey, Ms. Rainey will correct me if I'm wrong, needs to be on the environmental impacts of the trees and the steep slopes, critical slopes, and the impact on Pollock Branch. So Ms. Rainey, would you kind of walk us through this, and please remind us what our focus needs to be as we make a recommendation to council.
Absolutely. The scope of the commission's review for this critical slope waiver request is to consider the impact of disturbance of the critical slopes that may cause one or more of the following negative impacts. One, erosion affecting the structural integrity of those features, referring to the critical slopes. Stormwater and erosion related impacts on adjacent properties. Stormwater and erosion related impacts to environmentally sensitive areas such as streams and wetlands. Increased stormwater velocity due to the loss of vegetation. Decreased groundwater recharge due to changes in site hydrology, and loss of natural or topographic features that contribute substantially to the natural beauty and visual quality of the community, such as loss of tree canopy, forested areas, or wildlife habitat. The Planning Commission should focus when making a recommendation to City Council according to the criteria set forth above, to make a finding that either one, the public benefit of allowing critical slope, disturbance of a critical slope outweighs the public benefit of undisturbed slope. Public benefits include, but not limited to, stormwater and erosion control that maintains the stability of the property and or quality of adjacent or environmentally sensitive areas, groundwater recharge, reduce stormwater velocity, minimization of impervious surfaces, and stabilization of otherwise unstable slopes. Or finding two, due to unusual size, topography, shape, location, or other unusual physical conditions or existing development of the property, one or more of these critical slope provisions would effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict the use, reuse of development, or redevelopment of such property, and would result in significant degradation to the site or adjacent properties. So again, we're really focusing in on those environmental factors, our erosion sediment control, our stormwater, our impacts to adjacent properties, and our environmentally sensitive areas, as well as the physical beauty and the robust potential habitat that can happen from more mature planting stands and those other criteria.
And Mr. Dawson is online and available to help us with this. Is he not?
Yes.
Oh, there he is. Okay, cool.
I'm
Great.
here.
Cool.
Yep.
All right. If the scope's clear, I'll jump into the report section. Excellent. Let's see. Rayanix LLC has requested a waiver from section 341120B to allow for construction of development that would have 21 multifamily residential units within a 3-story building fronting on 6th Street Southeast. Improvements specific to the area where critical slopes would be impacted should the waiver be approved are shown on the critical slope exhibit and include a portion of the building, parking lot access via Rayon Street, sidewalks, retaining walls, and bicycle parking area. Approximately 32.5% of the critical slopes on site and 13% of the total critical slope area, which extends beyond the subject property, would be impacted by the proposal. The property is zoned downtown extended, for which the intent is stated in section 543.2 is to encourage an interrelated mix of high density residential and commercial uses harmonious with the downtown business environment within developments that facilitate convenient pedestrian and other links to the downtown area. As noted, that applicant has indicated that 21 1 and 2 bedroom multifamily units are proposed, which would have an approximate dwelling density of 27 dwelling units per acre, which would be considered high density per our comprehensive plan. Each applicant for a critical slope waiver is required to articulate a justification for the waiver and to address how the land disturbance as proposed will satisfy the purpose and intent of the critical slopes regulations as found within section 34.1120B1. The applicant has provided information in the critical slopes waiver narrative for both findings 1 and 2. The city staff has concurred with the applicant's analysis for finding 2 and recommends that the waiver be approved under section 34.1120B(c)(d), finding 2, which states due to the unusual size, topography, shape, location, or other unusual physical conditions or existing development of a property, one or more of the critical slopes provisions would effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict the use, reuse, or redevelopment of such properties, or would result in significant degradation of the site or adjacent properties. However, due to the lack of prepared engineered plans with sequencing of construction and clear narrative specifying how slopes and downstream waters will be protected during construction, and stormwater quality and quantity managed afterwards in accordance with section 34.1120B(6)(d), city engineering recommends conditions be placed on the waiver to ensure adequate protection for critical slopes outside of the limits of disturbance and stabilization for impacted critical slopes. The Environmental Sustainability Department has noted that the site has significant tree canopy and other pervious surface coverage, roughly half of which is proposed to be converted to impervious surface. As a result, the site will produce significantly more stormwater runoff in the post-development condition. Given that Fox Branch has significant water quality and quantity challenges, the applicant is encouraged to incorporate water quality and quantity treatment into the site design. If not managed properly on site, this additional stormwater will leave the site with increased velocity and have the potential to cause increased pollutant loading and erosion and sediment in Fox Branch. Additionally, 5 mature trees that are within 10 to 20 dBH, which is diameter at breast height, are proposed to be removed from the existing critical slope area, including several in areas where the critical slopes are more than 60%. Areas with slopes greater than 60% and large stands of trees are specifically called out in section 34.1126E1 and 3 as particularly sensitive and important. To mitigate this, habitat redevelopment should be completed in the form of planting of locally native tree species in the critical slope area, not to contain buildings, parking lots, sidewalks, or other built improvements. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission consider the following and make it a recommendation to City Council. 1, erosion affecting the structural integrity of the critical slopes adjacent properties or environmentally sensitive areas. City engineering has noted concerns regarding lack of information regarding construction sequencing and stormwater management practices. Erosion and sediment control measures can be conservatively designed to minimize the risk for discharge to the critical slopes remaining on the adjacent parcel. Loss of tree canopy and wildlife habitat that contribute to the natural beauty and visual quality of the community. The site currently has significant tree canopy covered, as noted before. Wildlife habitat is likely to be reduced by the clearing of existing mature canopy and understory growth on the site. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries recommends a varying level of vegetation, such as herbaceous layers, shrub layer, sapling layer, and larger tree canopy to promote a diversity of species. The planting of locally native woody and herbaceous vegetation could be required to both stabilize remaining slopes and minimize the impact to large stands of trees, vegetative canopy, and wildlife habitat. And finally, mentioned before, the comprehensive plan and land use, the proposed high density residential use is in line with the general land use plan of the comprehensive plan, which calls for the property to be mixed use. As noted in some previous conversations, by email, the proposed building height does not meet the recommendations in the SIA plan for this mixed-use urban corridor listing, which is Transect T5. However, the lower height, staff finds the lower height to be more appropriate, the 3 stories proposed, given the proximity of 1 and 2 story houses in the area. And regarding our recommended conditions, per section 341120B 6E, City Council may impose conditions upon a critical slope waiver to ensure the development will be consistent with the purpose and intent of the critical slope provision. Should the Planning Commission find recommendation of the waiver to be appropriate, staff recommends the Planning Commission consider the following conditions to mitigate potential impacts. 1, site plans, including BESCP plans, should include at a minimum 4 stages or phases of erosion sediment ESC controls. The first shall consist of initial preliminary controls and outfall construction. The second shall include the establishment of a sediment trap and conveyances or appropriate stormwater infrastructure as referenced in the applicant's letter. The sequence shall dictate that no disturbance of the critical slopes beyond what is necessary to install perimeter controls and conveyances can occur until after establishment of a functioning sediment trap. Number 2, super silt fence, also known as chain linked backing, shall be installed where perimeter silt fence is specified. Number 3, any disturbance occurring outside of conveyances to the trap or other approved perimeter controls in either sequence or space, planned or unforeseen, shall be immediately stabilized with sod, or for pervious areas, utilities within impervious areas shall have other same-day stabilization measures provided. Number 4, at no time shall concentrated water be directed towards the critical slopes. Number 5, habitat redevelopment shall be completed in the form of replacement of trees removed from the critical slope areas at up to a 3-to-1 ratio. The planting shall be locally native species appropriate for the site conditions and located in the critical slope area, not to contain buildings, parking lots, sidewalks, or other built improvements. These plantings are intended to mitigate negative impacts per section 341120 B1, A, B, C, D, and F, and are to be provided detailed on the final site plan and approved by the city prior to final site plan approval. The specific number and species of replacement trees will be determined by the applicant and the city based on available space and site conditions. As Chair Mitchell noted previously, our city engineer Jack Johnson is here as well, and we're happy to answer any questions. And our applicant also has a few moments, wants to speak for a few moments as well, I believe.
So I want to open this up to the commission for comment, but before I do that, let me ask if this went before council in 2019. I think it was prior to that, and there were concerns. Does this plan address the concerns that council had in 2019 when they rejected this, or are those concerns relevant to the new plan?
Without directly pulling up the minutes from those meetings, my memory serves that the concerns, there's still some of the concerns present. However, there's less of an impact at this point in time to the critical slopes area. So the previous request that was considered in 2019 included a second building that was fronting on 2nd Street Southeast. This current proposal does not include any improvements to that area. However, that's a significant portion of that frontage is critical slope, and that would have been a much greater overall impact to the critical slope area to include that construction. So there is, I think, an improvement in that aspect of the proposal. I think, council, if I recall correctly, spoke generally about just overall loss of canopy, concerns about erosion on other, all the pieces kind of we're talking about, concerns to other property in the Pollux branch. And so I think the impact is lessening here, but overall perhaps shown in a similar way. But I'll defer to our applicant and Mr. Dawson if they want to
Justin, as you're
get into the details.
Prepping to step up, could you begin thinking about that question? So I'll begin with the end of the dice. Bill, any questions for the applicant?
Yeah, I don't think I have any questions. Thanks.
Ms. Russell?
Yeah, I did have some questions for the applicant. I guess I'll just kind
No,
of.
no, I'm sorry. This is for staff. I'm sorry.
Staff.
My fault. Yeah.
We have reviewed the question I had about proposed connection being allowable from Rayon, which was helpful to understand that it's not an extension of a street, it's a connection of a parking lot to a street, which was helpful for me to understand that. We clarified the question about sidewalks. My questions are more generally geared towards the applicant.
Okay, cool. Sorry to confuse me and you. Rory, Mr. Stolzenberg.
Yeah, a couple questions. I guess first one is for Mr. Dawson. So we talked a lot about, or in the applications, we talk a lot about how the western slope is the natural slope and the northern slope facing the X parking lot is the man-made one as part of the part of building the factory. And so in 2019, there was a commercial building on that western slope that heavily impacted that one. In this application, we're only infringing on that northern slope. So I guess the question is, do those behave differently? Are there potentially impacts on that western slope as a result of cutting into the northern slope?
Your environmental impacts and the difference between a native slope and a constructed slope. Is that your question? Or
yes, and also whether if we're only cutting into the one slope, are there potentially impacts to the one that isn't necessarily being directly cut into?
So no, because essentially the western slope flows to the west and the northern slope flows to the north, impacts to the northern slope would not affect the western slope unless you had some catastrophic and you're incising a massive channel and the whole thing collapses. But the project area being on top of both slopes, where its drainage can contribute to either slope, is the threat to both slopes from the sort of enhanced erosion sediment control that was suggested.
Gotcha. So to clarify then, the worry is that during construction and also after, when that impervious surface is there, that there might be excess water flowing over that western slope that could impact it. And so what we're trying to make sure is that all the water is conveyed safely to a retention pond or to the stormwater source.
Correct. To the storm drain system, at least, yes.
That makes sense. Thanks. And then my question for Ms. Rainey is this overparked? So I see 21 1 or 2 bedroom units, which is a base parking requirement of 21 spaces. And then I see that there are 10 bike lockers indoors provided on site. And in the preliminary site plan, or actually it's a final site plan, I guess, it says that 5 of those bike lockers satisfy the requirement and 5 satisfy the parking exemption. Therefore, it's only a 1 space reduction. But I think from the conversation we just had about University Way, because those are lockers, even though they're required bike parking, they still count towards that off-street parking reduction. And therefore, it would seem to me that there would only be 19 spaces required on site. Is that correct?
Sorry, I'm just looking up to make sure I state this.
And while she's
correctly.
looking, translate that for me, if you don't mind, Rory, into the environmental considerations, steep slope.
Yeah, so I mean,
impact
the
on
whole impact on the slope pretty much, right, is because of this giant parking lot that is required.
Okay,
So if we can kind of scooch in one of the edges by, say, 1 parking spot, that would reduce the impact on the slopes. And ultimately, I guess where I'm getting at is if it's determined that we need less parking than is provided, is it reasonable? This is a question for Ms. Robertson. Is it a reasonable condition to say that no more parking than the minimum off-street parking requirement be provided on site?
And tell me again how that will promote the protection of The area that's disturbed?
It would reduce the boundary of the impingement on the slopes.
If Mr. Dawson agrees that those things are related and will actually help protect the environment that's being disturbed, I'm okay with that condition.
So my basis for that is that the westernmost parking space in the plan is directly in one of the steep slope areas.
So Rory,
As long as Mr. Dawson agrees that those things are related in terms of either the work that's being done or sort of the long-term existence of the disturbed area, I think that's an okay condition.
So Rory, so I'm on board because the other guys may be, but back me up. And what's your concern, and how does this impact the environmental issue?
I think the way that the applicant calculated the required parking may be incorrect in that they thought they needed more parking under the ordinance than they actually do. And if in fact they don't need as much as they put in, then we can reduce the scope of the impacts on the slope by reducing the parking down to what's actually required. And that's based on our prior discussion for University Way and how we were talking about bike lockers.
So do me a favor and ask the applicant that question as well when they're up. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
And I think if I'm wrong about that and it comes out later that it is required, the way I worded my proposed condition allows for that to be worked as well.
Yeah, cool. All right. Jack, does that make sense to you?
It does. I think that Mr. Stoltenberg's suggestion that reducing it would reduce the impacts of slopes is, generally correct. Just looking at the geometry of the site, and the plan northwest has the greatest impacts into the site, and shifting that all 9 feet or whatever that dimension is probably would serve that intent. Yes.
Cool.
And just to add to that, so there's the bike parking reduction, and the second one I'm not quite as sure of, but it says in the plan that the handicap spot is van accessible. And in the off-street parking reduction ordinance, it says that van accessible spaces that are marked as such count as 3, which would be a further 2-space reduction. And if that is the case, I'm not sure if that can be double counted against the handicap spot. But if so, I'd be curious if that is also a possible reduction.
My interpretation has been that the van space required for the parking reduction is not specifically limited to those with disabilities, so the handicap parking spaces, but simply a van space really to get towards carpooling, as it were, or group transit has been my interpretation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Reverend Heaton.
I have no comment.
Mrs. Soliates.
Significance. Oh God, why does this all matter? My background is the environmental nonprofit world, and we never talked about the global importance of disturbing or preserving steep slopes. How significant is this compared with other concerns for the city, say schools or housing?
How about protecting our environment? But I'll let other people answer the question.
Significance.
It'll also be a good thing to keep in mind that the applicant has provided a proposal, and the suggestions that you all are providing can be helpful if they're choosing to vary that proposal. But you all have the opportunity here to react to what's before you. And so we're starting to move into items that would be handled in other pieces of this proposal. So I just want to have you be mindful of that once the applicant has the opportunity to speak and share the vision of their project a little more fully and be able to consider your comments at that point in time.
So, a couple of thoughts on my part. The application, as I read it, I may have missed some stuff, but there is a unclear articulation of the plan for erosion and sediment design control. Unless I missed something. There's an unclear articulation of the construction sequencing in stormwater management practices. And I worry about what the impact that's going to have on Pollock Branch. But Ms. Rainey and Mr. Dawson have done a pretty good job of putting controls in place in the recommendations if we approve this to protect those pieces. So my question is to engineering and to the planning, NDS, are the eight or nine points that you guys suggested we embrace if we approve this, do they address the issues that are not mentioned in Mrs. Schimp's proposal?
Yes, as we discussed this a little bit before, there is a plan that accompanies that was submitted before, at least a site plan that showed all the erosion controls, which may or may not have been included, or an augmentation to the submittal, but I did review those. And my conditions, I first read those conditions without actually reviewing that plan, and I only added one comment after reviewing that plan. And without getting into all the details, you know, as you can imagine, the construction in the site is occurring on top of the slopes. So if you expose the ground, whether they're the actual slopes themselves or on top of the slopes that will be contributing runoff to the slopes, and you get a rain event, you're not only moving sediment onto the slopes, but then you're causing erosion to the slopes, especially as you've scoured the vegetation, which is providing some runoff reduction there. You know, the critical slopes is in the city code. This whole process is in code. So this is something that we have, you know, I have to do regardless of my opinions on, you know, whether this is a good idea or not. And I did this, if you look at per finding 2, if you look at the shape of the site, there certainly are impacts, especially to the one side of the site, which would limit the use of that. I did concur with the applicant that probably does make sense. And to answer your question finally, yes, my conditions are geared at making sure that nothing unforeseen happens during construction when the slopes are most sensitive, that they're not impacted. And it doesn't go into water quality or water quantity, as those things are handled in a separate process with strict compliance of what we have the authority to enforce on all projects that meet that threshold. So I did the best I can, I suppose.
Okay, so the bottom line is like the things that were missing in the report, you think that your conditions addressed, and they'd have to, in this final site plan, they'd have to like make you happy that they're protecting.
Correct.
Thank you. Cool. Council, any questions or concerns? This is pretty close to your interest. Is the council still here?
I think we're down to just the one.
Who's the one?
Councilor Payne.
Michael, any concerns? You hung around for this, and I appreciate that because this is going to be important to you guys. Okay. All right. Input. Let's kind of go from left to right. Any thoughts, and then we'll see if we can get a motion.
Applicant presentation.
You know, thank you. Justin, you want to present?
Yes, please. Good evening, everyone. Justin Schimp, the engineer for the project. I don't have any kind of elaborate presentation. I think a lot of the important facts of it were actually just discussed with Mr. Dawson, the city engineer. Simply is about managing the construction process. Our plan outline some of the things suggest it does need some refinement. He's right about the outfall location being first and that being critical. I agree with that. So we don't have a problem with his conditions. I think they make sense. So I would want to point out an interesting, twist of this as it relates to, from last time to this time is the last time, of course, we were disturbing some of the natural slope, the one that goes down towards Second Street, whatever it may be called is. But the slope we're disturbing our parking lot is all the result of construction of a looking lot. That was all cut back. And if you look at that slope, you've been off the site, you can see clearly where it was cut. Years ago, that parking lot expansion, I was discussed in the staff report. And so the particular vegetation, that part of the site, also sort of its contribution to positive environmental impacts, I think, are minimized because it was a result of construction years ago. The challenge of the site is to staying off those slopes is that it's narrow. It's a very skinny parcel, and we can only fit a row of parking on the site. And then that's the minimum dimension. And you'll see a plan that the sidewalk essentially in some of the park spaces into the slope, and there is no way around that in this particular instance. So though we find ourselves the disturbance certainly much more minimal than previous conditions address the risk to the Pollock's branch that have been discussed under consideration. So I don't have anything else to particularly share. Happy to answer questions may arise. I'll open the parking since that did come up. If to my understanding, we're showing the minimum number of parking spaces already. That van space is about a train.
Hey, Justin,
Yes.
Can I ask you, if you don't mind, to turn your video off? Because the bandwidth is not working so well. We want to hear you. You're a good-looking guy, but we'd like to hear you better than we're looking at you.
I appreciate that. I'll be happy to oblige.
Yeah, that'll help us hear you better. Okay, so please continue.
Okay, so.
Oh, much better. Thank you.
Okay. Not
it was better.
My office before. That's a new one. I apologize. So the only other thing I'd bring up then, if you just looking at the diagram attached to our application is a pink highlighted slope section. Are you still having trouble hearing me?
Yeah, we are. Yeah. Rory, what did you say? What do you want to do?
So there's like a phone call-in number, right? Could we maybe try that instead?
I can try that. I don't know what the issue would be. Let me do that if you guys want to.
Hey, Justin, this is Joe Rice. Do you happen to have that number on hand through the email that you received?
I imagine it's in your email earlier.
We can resend it if necessary.
Let me just try a different location, a different computer real quick. Hang on a second.
Yeah, Commissioner Russell made a good point. It might help if everyone else muted themselves. Yeah. It could be an echo.
So while we're at it, just a little celebration. So Missy, thank you for orchestrating the vaccinations, and hopefully all of us through Missy or somebody got a shot in the arm.
I had very little to do with that except the coordination end. Once you all are temporary workers, and so you all have the opportunity as part of the city workforce to move through that. And it was very on the spot timing kind of thing. But I'm glad some folks were able to do that. And those I didn't hear from right away, I gave a call, and pretty much everyone had the opportunity or was
Great.
already in process. So it
So
worked
yeah,
out well.
good news is everybody got a chance. So yeah, I'll get my second shot on Thursday. So I will get my second shot on Thursday. So yeah, yay! Thank you, Missy. And City. So Justin, you there?
Chair, he called in and I am allowing him to speak if he is calling on the 953-6116 number.
Hello, Justin. You're back.
Okay. Yeah, I've been many calls in my office and I've never had that problem. So I don't
You're
know
loud and clear.
what the story is. Oh, very good. Well, I think we went over everything. I have the site plan up in front of me and certainly can answer any questions that the commission has.
So let's just go from left to right. Bill, any questions? Bill.
Sorry, I'm on mute. No, I don't have any questions. Thanks.
And Liz? You had some good questions.
I'm curious, in 2019, the applicant, I think it was SHIP at the time, included a proposed mixed use, component to this development, and why the change to all residential? And with that question, would there be any less parking requirement if there were a commercial component?
So we originally had the mixed use building fronting sort of down the Ix side, which we thought made more sense as 6th Street was a bit more residential in nature. And of course, the downside of commercial is it generally actually requires more parking per sort of square foot of structure than residential. So in fact, even in that scheme, we would have to develop any sort of meaningful commercial would have had to get a parking agreement with the Ix parking lot next door, so folks could have parked down on that side to get into the commercial spaces. So that, I think that's why we dropped it. It was we scaled back the intensity development a fair bit, and that commercial went with it.
Yeah, I'll note that's a pretty steep grade. I mean, even your parking lot plan as, your site plan proposes at least, I think, a 13-foot retaining wall on at least the north side, right? So I would imagine it'd be a pretty dramatic grade to have commercial facing 2nd Street to get down to 2nd Street.
It was a complicated building, a multiple step building to make that happen. And it certainly would have been more challenging from a erosion control standpoint during construction.
A second question is, I guess kind of related to possible creativity in retaining existing large trees or interesting features. I mean, what you have is a by the book parking lot. You're an engineer, that's what you design. Is there any flexibility within the plan that would allow for retaining large feature trees? I also didn't appreciate that there's a sidewalk in front of the curb, the parking curbs, and is that a code requirement? Because that's, is there any way to adjust the parking, whether it's reducing it, reconfiguring it, tweaking it a little bit to lessen the impact on the critical slopes and try to keep as many of those large trees as possible?
So as to the trees, it is difficult to maintain those when you are doing any kind of work in the area, right? Because then any sort of grading activity will damage the roots. My assessment of the trees and the slope, at least, the steep slope areas, not a lot of those are the kind of trees that will, live a long time. There's some of the, I like to call them silver maples, and there's some cherries. They're nice trees, but they do they suffer storm damage, and they are generally kind of faster growing, hardwood trees. Those would be sort of ones replaced, the ones impacted would be replaced at that 3-to-1 ratio with more native trees from as per the requirements of the condition. As the sidewalk, I believe that's a Carrie question, but I believe that would be required by the ordinance to have access from the parking spaces up to the building without being in the travelway. I mean, I think practically that sidewalk could go at least up until the accessible parking spaces. We need to have it there, obviously, to get folks in and out of the building, but I'd be happy to remove that sidewalk and reduce the impact of the slopes if that were permissible by the city code.
Should I jump in with the city codes? Okay, I didn't want to speak out of turn. So section 34897 covers particularly pedestrian walkways and internal access to our site in general. Subsection A of that states a pedestrian access and circulation system shall be provided for every development and shall be designed so as to provide for safe, attractive, and convenient pedestrian travel. Provision shall be made for sidewalks and pedestrian walkways which enable pedestrians to walk safely and conveniently between buildings on site and from site to adjacent properties. And it sort of keeps going from there, but you know, I would read the requirement to have safe and convenient access to include from the parking area to the building. So I would interpret that code section as requiring sidewalk or other pathway from the parking spaces to the building in this case. I also think it's, you know, generally a good idea to have folks have a place to walk where possible.
Understood. Also, just a very constrained site. Let's see. Okay, that gets that. You mentioned, we talk about, maybe this is getting into more commentary, but I'll just end with this. We talk about the number of units driving the number of parking spaces, and is there any way to reduce that? And I would pose this question to the applicant and to the group, is it possible that lessening the density of this apartment could result in a parking number that less, you know, severely impacts the critical slope? And should we be approaching it from that mindset in like right sizing the development per the constraints of the site?
You know, I'll respond as quickly to that if I could, and that certainly the way that the lot is laid out, you know, the parking has to be in this orientation. So, you know, you could take some parking spaces off the end, but you're not saving very many trees per parking space. And I just giving context of, like, you know, when I do developments anywhere else, when we do something in a more rural area or in Albemarle County, like there's a quantity always of, you know, trees cut per, you know, residential unit built. And I think that some context also folks to consider is that this is relatively small, a very small amount per unit. Everywhere we, you know, put people, unless with the rare case we have a parking lot we can redevelop, generally involves some kind of clearing of land and some kind of impact. And so I think while there is a slope here that we need to deal with, the overall sort of impact per unit is pretty small. And that, you know, if you don't build them here, they end up somewhere else, and likely, you know, trees are lost in those locations. It's a totally fair question, but I would just, I think I calculated a minute ago the area, and so it's 0.003 acres per parking spot is the kind of the area of the slope disturbed, roughly, just to give you some context.
Right. Okay. That's all the questions. I do have some further opinions.
So, Reverend Heaton.
No, I don't have any other questions. I think we're zeroing in on our environmental concerns. So,
Cool. Mrs. Soliers.
No questions. Thank you.
Chair Mitchell, may I ask?
It's my
did I get
turn.
to get there?
It's my turn. But actually, I don't want to turn, so go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize I was last. I thought we were still going down the line. I do have a couple questions. Well, first, could you repeat what you said in your presentation about the parking lot? To be honest, I couldn't hear it.
Were the existing parking lots, you mean?
I'm not sure.
Or the design of our parking?
I don't know. I heard parking lot and then I couldn't understand anything after that. But if you don't remember,
I know
okay.
I mean, I was a few things, but one point that I tried to make, and I hope everyone heard it. If not, I should repeat it again, is that essentially this whole activity is being generated because a slope was created by the construction of a parking lot that essentially sits vacant all the time, or, you know, it's storing some cars or trucks here or there. So effectively, you've got a empty parking lot that the construction thereof created a slope waiver process, which in effect is a potential hindrance to a housing project. So that was the point I was trying to make about that parking lot.
Got it. So you're talking about the one in Ix, like off the side.
In the X, yes, that's right.
Great. That good segue into my first question, which is, did you guys explore a shared parking agreement with them? I think you mentioned it for the mixed use portion, but you know, is it possible to build this apartment building or potentially even more units by just having off-site parking?
Well, I suppose it could be, and this is something this project's been going on for many years. My client has spoken with the Ix folks, but they've never been able to come to any sort of agreement. I think maybe the Ix folks are, you know, in planning of their own and not wanting to, you know, lose parking or compromise any of their options for us, which I understand. I think that's fair. But we've not made any headway on that, any kind of shared development options over time. It has been discussed several times over the years, but I think we've landed on the best way to develop this property is sort of on its own with a modest apartment building.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess second question is, there appears to be like a 10-foot buffer to the south side before the parking starts. So it seems like if you kind of just, again, scooch the whole thing 10 feet to the south towards Rayon, there wouldn't really be any impact on the critical slopes in the back. So what's driving that buffer? Is that required for some reason?
There is, yes, there's an ordinance required buffer of 10 feet, a landscape buffer in that zone. And so we have the curb line right up against that buffer, but it cannot go any further in that direction.
Gotcha. And is there a mechanism to get that waived, or is that a hard requirement?
Not that I'm aware of. It's written into the zoning district, the code for that zoning district. So I suspect it would require like a zoning text amendment to be waived.
Yes, I would agree that, or similar to what we talked about with the Lind Hall apartments. When you are applying for a special use permit, you can ask for modifications to a side yard, but it could not be the main part of your request. So you can't have a special use permit request just to modify offset requirements. But if there was a special use permit request, it could be added into the request.
Gotcha. Okay. Our ordinance strikes again. So there's a 10-foot alley adjacent to the site. Are you planning any improvements to that alley? And I noticed when I went out there that there were like wooden posts going in. Was that you guys? And what's the plan there?
Oh, I don't know about any post. I don't know if the owner's working on something there or not. I actually do not know the answer to that. But the alley serves the driveway for one of those lots adjacent. So our plan is to not touch that alley.
Okay. Great. Let's see here. Oh yeah, and then my last question, I guess, was about the trees on site. So when I went out there and kind of traipsed into the yard a little bit, my impression of a lot of those trees, especially at the very top of the slope, was that they were in poor condition. Now, I'm not really an expert, but I've listened to Commissioner Lehendro a bunch and read the urban forestry reports. Can you guys speak to the condition of those trees that you're removing?
I don't have a detailed report on the actual trees as far as we haven't had an arborist come and do a sort of a detail of it. I know there are up on the sort of higher side, the non-slope area, there are some, you know, larger, I would say, healthier species trees, but you know, all the trees in the slopes are ones that have grown up after the slope was built, the parking lot was built. And so I don't think any of those trees were actually planted there strategically. I think they simply came up as sort of the fast propagating trees in the forest do. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you saw trees that looked unhealthy, it may very well be they're approaching the end of their lives, and those kind of trees are the ones that tend to get zapped by ice storms or just, you know, lose a lot of limbs because they're not a tree that by design lives hundreds of years. They tend to have a shorter lifespan. They may be some of them. My feeling from being out there in that slope was those are the kind of trees that are kind of not the type that lasts hundreds of years to become sort of a staple tree that you look at and you enjoy, but the kind that are a maintenance headache to cut up when they fall down in an ice storm.
And the trees that you'd be putting in as replacements would be those? Or...
Yeah, those would be more intentional. So those, for example, would be oaks and elms and trees that are more typically seen in like a native mature forest. That's the point of that condition. It talks about those particular sort of tree species.
Okay, and then last question, in relation to what I said earlier, is your intention to not be over parked, to be at the minimum amount of parking required?
Yes, I would say that certainly. We're not trying to do any more spaces than the code requires. We are sensitive to the balance of, you know, we want to have enough parking spaces for the folks who live there, but I'm also in general agreement with your principle you mentioned earlier that, you know, if you build it, they will come sort of thing, as an element of building more parking yields more cars. If we can drop a space or something like that, that doesn't necessarily offend me. Again, it also saves a pretty small amount of disturbance. It's like 145 square feet or something like that per parking space. So it's something that could be explored, but I think it's not going to make a dramatic difference in what the impacts are or really affect our ability to manage those one way or the other.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so any other commission questions? If not, I'm going to get council a chance to jump in. Council, Michael, Lloyd. Okay, so what do we think?
I'm interested in the opportunity of better utilizing that alley, and if there were opportunities there. I didn't quite understand what the resolution was, but it seems like it's a waste of space if you have an alley and then a buffer and then a parking lot, and they're kind of taking up a lot of prime real estate. That's pushing the parking lot into the critical slope. Could it be avoided?
Well, yeah, let's Justin's still on. So Justin, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure we actually have a legal access to that alley, is the thing. I don't believe it was part of our plat. So I looked at that very early on, but essentially it serves a residential use on the side. We concluded pretty quickly that it was difficult to use that alley because the zoning is different of those two parcels.
Sure, but
and
could
so
the buffer be reduced then?
Well,
for Ms. Robertson, you know, if there's a 10-foot buffer required between low density uses and multifamily in DE, did the 10 foot of that alley count, or does it not because it's not an SQ type?
I believe that the buffer typically has to be on your own property. So between your property line and the edge of the building or its structures.
But so it is a public alley, right? Like a public right of way. So, I mean, anyone would have the right to use it. Is that
Not
correct?
necessarily. It can depend, but most alleys are privately owned.
So in this case, at least on GIS, it does appear to be public.
Yeah, I'd have to, there's only a handful of alleys that have been accepted by the city for maintenance. And I'm sorry, I don't have that. It's a really old list and I don't have it handy.
Is there a difference between like a platted alley and an accepted alley?
Yes. Yes.
And what does that mean between accepted? And
So let's say you're looking at the original plat for Belmont. It might have had a bunch of alleys on it, but most of them were never intended to be dedicated for public use. They're ways for adjacent lot owners to access the rear of their lots. You go back through all the deeds, it depends on what the subdivision ordinance said at a particular period in time. It depends on whether or not there's language in the subdivision plat or any deeds that talk about dedication for public use. It's not an easy undertaking. You have to look at each one separately, but there are a handful of alleys which are more modern alleys that were created with the specific intention to allow the city to put utilities or that sort of thing in them. So there are a number of alleys that the city has accepted as being dedicated for public use usually because they have utilities in them. It's rare that the city owns an alley to provide, for vehicular or pedestrian traffic.
Here's the question. Is an alley zone something? Like it is within the boundaries of a zoning district, right?
Sometimes you'd have to look at the zoning map. Sometimes the zoning map includes public streets. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't know how the zoning map should shade most of the alleys because in most cases they are private, the adjacent lot owners, whether or not it's showed as part of their lot, actually own title to the center line going up as a platted alley.
Gotcha. So yeah, the complication here is the GIS only shows it on parcels. And then if I look at the zoning map, there's a big border line that covers it up. So I don't know. But if we were to assume that the alley was zone DE, at least possibly to the center line, would that mean that this parcel on that side that's adjacent to the alley isn't adjacent to a low density residential district in a way that would require a buffer?
I will let Ms. Rainey answer that question.
So to make sure I understand, you're referencing if our zoning map showed basically, I guess, ownership to the center line of the alley for each adjacent landowner, which would make the portion of the alley adjacent to the subject property downtown extended. And then the other half of the alley R2, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, pretty much. Because like, if you had an entire actual owned parcel all the way across that happened to be DE, then it wouldn't be adjacent and it wouldn't require a buffer. So does the half of the alley count in the same way?
That's not typically how we approach the interpretation of the ordinance in that regard. And you want to start going that route, applicants are going to have to submit title work with their applications because I can't give people a title opinion for their property. I can tell you guys whether our office thinks that the city owns a piece of property, but I can't give a title opinion to somebody else. So we look at where the platted alleys are, and usually the platted alleys come burdened in some way to allow somebody to share the use of those. Usually each adjacent property owner has a right to use the alley to access his or her property. And so there is a property line that is outside the alley. It's on the edge of the alley. And the usual interpretation of the zoning ordinance provisions for buffers starts at your property line and is measured into the interior.
So could someone remind me what we're trying to accomplish tonight at this point?
So I think we're saying that this buffer requirement is forcing more impingement into the slope. And so if it were not to apply on slightly more than half of this parking lot, that would, again, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Russell, that's roughly the idea.
You got it. Trying to do everything we can to pull the
I
think we lost her, but I think she was saying wherever we can to pull it off the slope we can. And here's one last question for Ms. Robertson. When we say adjacent to a low density residential district, if it were across the street, that buffer requirement would not apply, right?
No, I think we usually interpret adjacent as including, across the street.
Oh, okay.
Carrie can correct me. We don't have Reed Broadhead on, but Carrie can correct me.
Carrie's
But
back.
that's my understanding.
And Liz is back. We lost you for a while, Liz.
I didn't catch what was Lisa saying?
Carrie, is that correct that adjacent includes areas across a public street?
I think that is generally correct. I'm trying to rack my brain for a circumstance where that would have a project I reviewed would have had that condition.
Well, actually, let me say, wouldn't that apply here because it's R1 across 6th Street? So that would require a 20-foot or a 10-foot buffer, but there's also a 15-foot max setback that isn't shown.
You all, these issues of interpreting the zoning ordinance language are really more for the city's zoning administrator. I mean, if you all would like to sort of informally request that during the process of this review that the zoning administrator look to see if there's any, to verify whether or not the buffer requirements apply on this site, I think that's fine, but there's not really a mechanism in this process for you all to waive it or kind of rewrite the zoning ordinance. The only other option for the applicant would be for there to be some condition that could be referenced as a hardship, and they'd have to go in that instance to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So I think, the people who can interpret these things are the zoning administrator and the Board of Zoning Appeals in the context of certain applications. I know what you're doing, but I think we're really going to have to sort of keep all these things in mind when you're rewriting the ordinance. So all of your, the things you're thinking of in terms of trying to design, how certain properties will relate to streets or alleys, that doesn't get in your way when you're trying to protect environmental issues. It is a difficult thing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thanks.
So remind me, we're still on the critical slope waiver, right? Yes. I am pretty comfortable with the mitigating issues that are in the staff report from page 7 to 8. So I'm pretty happy with what they want to do. Lyle?
I'd like to make a motion.
Please.
I move to recommend approval of the application for a special use permit. Wait, nope. Let's try that again.
I have another, sorry, I'm going to interrupt because I have another thing that I want to bring up. And sorry. The building, the site plan shows a building that does not have a relationship with 6th Street. What I mean, that follows the typical pattern of the existing houses along 6th Street. And I'm wondering if it wouldn't be possible, or, you know, adversely impact all the configurations of everything we're talking about, to have it fall more in line with the other houses along the streetscape. You know, I don't know how to explain this, and I'm not an architect, but I'm gonna try that. It's not fronting 6th Street in a way that relates to 6th Street. It's fronting 6th Street in a way that is just oriented, you know, like a square, when if it were, you know, built with a little bit more sensitivity and design, it would be a parallelogram. Or
Are you talking about the design that we've been given, or the impact?
I'm talking about the
critical
site
slope waiver?
The building that is shown on the site plan, not related to the critical slope, is there could be more nuance to it that would improve its design. And if we have the ability, if we don't have the ability to offer comment to that, fine. But
so 2 thoughts about that, Ms. Rainey. How does that impact our ability to vote to move forward or not on the critical slope waiver? And 2, if it does not impact that, how can we impact this when we do the site plan?
Sure. So the facade of the building, or we'll start with the facade at 6th Street is not within our critical slope areas. So, you know, I think the specific design of the building and that portion is something that I think might be beyond the scope of conditions or you know, modification or review with a critical slope waiver, since you know, I'm not seeing, at least offhand, how modifying that would have any impact on our runoff, you know, adverse or improvement to the critical slopes, those pieces. I suppose arguably the rear of the building, if it was to change orientation to sort of quote match the front on 6th Street, that there might be slightly less of the building in the critical slopes. However, I'm not quite hearing any reasons that it needs to be modified due to the critical slopes. You know, we're talking about more about street experience, which is certainly important, and certainly, you know, something that can be discussed. I think it would be more appropriate in the preliminary, or excuse me, in the final site plan review process. It would not be, to my knowledge, something that could be required by anybody upon the applicant, but certainly recommendations and comments, you know, could be made to that effect. And they're meeting the setback requirements of the street frontage there from the code requirement. So there's no issue there, but I'm personally struggling to connect that change to the front to the critical slope impact.
sure. I guess what I'm struggling with here is that how in the future can we provide that new development be well designed? I mean, that there are elements of design that maybe those things get captured in districts under architectural design control, but does that mean that districts that aren't don't get that same level of care? You know, and I just have to say that this development is the most sustainable thing to do, if we were thinking from what is the most environmentally sustainable thing, would be to renovate that existing 3,000 square foot house and make it into apartments. And that wouldn't require, I would think, would require much less parking. And so I'm just sort of mourning the loss of that. But I understand it's not zoned for that. It's not under any sort of architectural design or historic district, but it's an existing housing unit within the city. So thanks for entertaining that.
So gang, where are we? We were talking about the waiver. Where are we?
Commissioner Sully Yates, want to say something?
I had a motion.
Love that you always do.
I try. I write a draft ahead of time. That's my secret. I move to recommend approval of the critical slope waiver for tax map and parcel 27003-6000 as requested with the conditions stated in the packet, based on a finding that due to unusual physical conditions or the existing development of the property, compliance with the city's critical slopes regulations would prohibit or unreasonably restrict the use or development of the property. For section 34-1120B6D2, let's say.
Your motion, is there a second?
Second.
Second from Reverend Eaton. Ms. Creasy, will you poll the board? Ms. Creasy, will you?
Sure, sorry, I had to unmute. Mr. Sully Yates,
Yes.
Mr. Heaton,
Yes.
Mr. Stollenberg,
Aye.
Ms. Russell,
Yeah, yes.
and Mr. Mitchell.
Okay. So we will move to approve the application and recommend approval of the application to council. So, is there anything else you guys like to chat about? I think Ms. Russell has some things that we're going to chat about, but we'll work on those before we bring them before you guys. Anything else?
I just have a question for staff. If it's worth doing a ZTI to note UTS stops exist in our ordinance.
Well, we are writing our zoning ordinance right now. I think it's something that we can discuss, so we can change it in the zoning ordinance as we complete the rewrite. I think that's an excellent decision or suggestion, rather.
Thank you.
And Ms. Russell, just very briefly, if you want to kind of walk the board through the things you're thinking about, give these guys a heads up. With the temporary housing thing.
The Airbnb thing?
Yeah. It's just let them know that you're thinking about it, so that we, when we're ready, we can bring it to them.
I'm thinking about it. I think our oh gosh, where do I start? Our enforcement of Airbnb, our policies around Airbnb, where we allow it by right to be non-owner occupied, could be creating a strain on our affordability market. I think it was Ms. Robinson that educated me that there are zones that allow, so the problem I see in my own neighborhood, I'll just say, are full-time Airbnbs, non-owner occupied. Okay, so those are houses completely taken out of the housing stock, and I thought that was a violation of our Airbnb policy. And I haven't investigated this much more, but apparently that there are districts that allow, if a district allows a hotel use, then that is allowable. And I just wonder what benefit is that serving our our neighborhoods. It might be creating an economic impact, but I don't think that's, I think it's creating an undue burden perhaps on neighborhoods. And I think we should consider that moving forward.
So not looking for a dialogue back and forth, just a heads up that these are things that we're thinking about. So.
Yeah, the other thing, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the other thing is if your neighbor or you know of somebody who is violating the Airbnb regulation, feel free to contact staff, because we are getting reports, and then when we do investigate them, and then if there is any violation, we we take necessary action. So if you have any address that you know is violating the Airbnb regulation, please, would like to for you to forward that address to us, and we'll look into that.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question about that? Commissioner Russell, don't you live in R2? Like,
I think so, yeah.
so hotels aren't a by right use there, right? So like, shouldn't that be a violation of?
I thought it, I mean, I think it is. And I just hadn't gotten around to, as Mr. Ikefuna mentioned, you know, doing anything about that. But the whole, you know, what floored me was it's allowable. It is allowable in other districts. So I just.
Yeah. Well, so another thing though, I remember reading some old article for when the homestay ordinance was passed, and as I recall, it was something like the ordinance says an individual who applies for a provisional use permit to authorize a homestay shall present proof of such individual's ownership of and permanent residence at. But then there was talk that like an LLC, if an LLC were to own the property in any zoning district and ask for a provisional use permit, that they wouldn't be subject to that requirement. Could I get clarification about whether that is a real thing?
About that. It's not in the ordinance. It's certainly the issue of LLCs owning property is certainly an issue, particularly in the vicinity of the University of Virginia. And, you know, it can be a structure that people use for, you know, various estate planning purposes, as well as, although it is specifically a type of entity that's supposed to be essentially a business entity. But, you know, we did not necessarily write that into the ordinance. I don't know how we're interpreting those provisions, but it is, you know, if the owner of a home is a company, a legal entity, you know, an LLC, you know, any member of an LLC can act on behalf of that entity, but it is a weird thing to, you know, you have to go through some, you know, gymnastics to attribute ownership of the property to the member or managing member of an LLC. It's not a very good fit with how we normally think about home ownership and owner occupied properties.
So I guess what I'm asking is like, does that mean the LLC, an LLC owned property can do whatever it wants with regard to Airbnb, or does that mean
not necessarily? So you know, but it requires you to drill down. It's not, the zoning administrator can't just go stand in front of the property and figure out whether it's in violation or not. You have to try to get more information. So if you are the only member of an LLC and you own, your LLC owns that property and you live there, it's easy enough to say it's owner occupied. But if an LLC has 4 members and they own a property, you know, then we've got to figure out like what they can't, they could certainly rent it to regular renters without violating the zoning ordinance. The question then becomes, can a 4-person LLC, who has to live there? Can any of the members be the owner? It's just complicated. Not saying that it'll necessarily have to turn out one way or the other. And I haven't, if I've ever seen an interpretation that involved that, it's not immediately coming to mind, but it's just not as easy for a zoning administrator to deal with as you might think.
if you just think about the impacts, right? My street has 20 houses, 20 units. I mean, 20 structures. Some are duplexes, but if 2 of those are not, are Airbnbs, extrapolate that across the city, and I think there's a problem.
So you all, I mean, it may well be time for you all to sort of undertake a comprehensive review of the city's Airbnb policies and regulations. When what we have was built in, it took probably a year and a half of pretty heated back and forth between, there's actually a short-term rental association in the Commonwealth, and there housing commission hearings in Richmond and all sorts of things. So it's very big business. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's a significant task, and it may well be time to revisit sort of the choices that have been made in the current ordinance and whether you would like those choices to be something different going forward. There was also originally a big discussion about, as there has been cities, whether a multifamily dwelling, whether someone who either owns or rents a unit can use that unit to make a little money on the side as a short-term rental. And some people said that helps support someone's income. Other people said that runs rents up. So there's some big policy decisions at issue, but you all should feel free to sort of dive in if that's, if it's time to revisit that, because when you actually, it would be good to have, your studies done and your policy discussions had by the time it's time to start putting pen to paper to write an updated zoning ordinance.
I pasted a discussion the Hack had on this topic in 2019. I was not the person who was quoted there. I was misquoted. That was not me. But this would be a really helpful thing for the housing coordinator to look at. I think they did look at it and said that it just wasn't significant enough for the city to act on it. But that was 2019.
The other thing we'll have to do is if you all want to extend owner occupancy requirements into the mixed use districts on a related issue, you're going to have to revisit sort of how you define what a hotel is. There's just a quirk in an ordinance that the definition of hotel can be any unit that's sort of an overnight accommodation for someone for a fee. So
okay, so we've covered all the things that I think we were hoping to cover. Is there anything else that you guys would like to chat about? Gary, we're gonna miss you, man. But you know what? You don't have to leave until later, so you can come back like next meeting or meeting after next. So if you're around, please come back.
Keep sending me the links until you have a replacement.
Cool. Yeah, we'll keep you around. And thank you for all you've done. We are grateful. All right, guys. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
I second.
See you guys later. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Good night, everyone.